Angola, a land of stunning landscapes, a rich network of cultures and languages, and a wealth of natural resources. This should be one of the jewels in the crown of Southern Africa, a place of happiness, prosperity, and hope. And perhaps it will be. Perhaps the coming years, decades, centuries will be kind to this nation on Africa's southwest coast. After centuries of colonial exploitation and decades of brutal conflict, this nation and her people have undergone unimaginable hardships and suffering. They deserve their time of peace and dignity. Since the fracturing of European colonial systems in Africa in the middle of the last century, Angola has been a scene of almost unrelenting bloodshed. It's also a place where global superpowers pull strings, flick switches, and cast human life aside as they play games of ideological and geopolitical supremacy. The Angolan Civil War was a tragedy on an enormous scale, but it was also a focal point for Cold War posturing, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and millions more with no place to go. This is Untangling Africa, and this is the Angolan Civil War, when ideologies and ethnicities collide and civilian communities are torn apart. A coastal nation of seafarers and explorers perched on the western extreme of Europe, Portugal got a head start on its neighbours in the race for imperial power. Reaching the Congo kingdom in what is now Angola as early as 1483, the Portuguese set about creating a colonial base in southwest Africa, exploiting its resources, dealing in slaves, and spreading their own brand of Christianity among the local population. Nearly 4.5 centuries later, and the Portuguese monarchy was finished. The Republic of Portugal was declared in 1910, and in 1926, the military seized power in a bloodless coup, paving the way for the fascist dictatorship of Antonio Salazar from 1932 onwards. But even after such wholesale change, the Portuguese were still in Angola. In fact, Angola was being pulled closer into Lisbon's orbit. By 1951, Angola was no longer a colony, instead transitioning to a province of Portugal itself. Those who thought this might herald a new era of equality between indigenous Angolans and their European Portuguese counterparts would have had their hopes quickly dashed. Forced labour, rampant exploitation, and the dilution of Angolan language, culture, and belief by mass migration from Europe pushed the region to the brink. But Angola was not isolated anymore. Centuries of maritime trade connected the land to the outside world. Money and commodities flowed back and forth across her ports and docks, and ideas did too. Ideas like African nationalism and decolonization. Ideas like Marxism and socialism. After 10 years of provincial status, the pressure cooker of Angola was ready to blow. Only 3 days into 1961, cotton plantation workers launched the Baixa de Cassange Revolt, a protest over their miserable working conditions. Identity cards were openly burned and Portuguese traders were assaulted on the plantation. The following day, Portuguese planes shattered the revolt, bombing villages indiscriminately and killing up to 7,000 people in a sickening display of power. In February, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA, formed only 5 years earlier, unsuccessfully attempted to spring some of its activists from an Angolan prison. In retaliation, settlers carried out their own raids on black Angolan neighborhoods, leaving countless dead in their wake. In March, another revolt broke out over forced plantation labor, and the colonial authorities hit back with more air raids in Baixa de Cassange and in the Icalo y Bengo region, while Portuguese ground forces moved in. Portuguese retaliation for the March revolt left some 20,000 natives dead. This might have caused outrage back home in Europe, but it didn't. As well as tens of thousands of African lives, the revolts had also claimed around 1,000 European lives. Some of these Europeans had been killed, often brutally and purposefully, some tortured and raped. It was this that caused the outrage back in Portugal. Public opinion was clear. The rebellion must be crushed. For more than a decade, bloody conflict ravaged Angola. The Union of Peoples of Angola, UPA, was one of the key belligerents, eventually merging with the Democratic Party of Angola, PDA, to form the National Liberation Front of Angola, FNLA. The MPLA also remained active, opening up a new front in the east of Angola. A third group, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, began their own campaigns in late 1966. As war spread across the country, it was often the local populations who suffered the most, as a diverse, complex, and centuries-old tribal network was shattered by the forces of modern ideology and weaponry. In 1968, the decades-long rule of Antonio Salazar was essentially at an end. A massive stroke put the dictator out of action, although he would live for another 2 years. The wheels of the Portuguese political machine were still turning though, and the fascist Estadio Novo limped on. The early 1970s brought new tactics from the colonial forces, reminiscent of those employed by the US in Vietnam, as napalm and defoliating agents sowed death and destruction in Angola, but still, they could not crush local resistance. In the end, it would be a domestic struggle that brought about the end of the empire. The Socialist Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974 shifted Portuguese politics from right to left. The following year, Angola declared independence. On November 11, 1975, the new nation of Angola was officially born. After 13 years of bloodshed, the Angolans had prevailed, freeing themselves from the yoke of Portuguese colonialism with a little help from political discord in Lisbon. But what is an Angolan? Are the Ovimbundu the true Angolans, the descendants of the Bantu tribes who settled the central coastal regions over the last 1,000 years? Or is it the Ambundu, another group tracing its lineage back to the Bantu, speaking the Kimbundu language and settling in the northwest? Or how about the Bakongo? The Bakongo and the Ambundu were once aligned until the latter won its independence way back in the 1550s. And what about other tribes, cultures, and communities that call this place home? More than 1/5 of modern Angolans are in this collective of different groups. The answer is all of the above. Angola is a richly diverse nation, a multitudinous landscape of cultures, languages, and identities. The Portuguese never had to bother themselves too much with this. They dealt with the prevailing forces in the region and used military might and economic power to subjugate the land until they could not do so anymore. But in a newly independent, post-colonial African nation, it was different. If Angola was going to have a new voice for a new age, all would need to be represented. But the new Angola had a new kind of diversity too. Political and ideological disagreement had been a common theme throughout the War of Independence, as the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA vied to be the dominant force in Angolan nationalism. Now, without a common enemy, their attentions began to turn toward one another. The MPLA was a Marxist socialist organization initially linked to the Mbundu people in the northwest. The internationalist outlook of the communist movement meant the MPLA had some powerful friends, particularly the Soviet Union and Cuba, as well as East Germany and Yugoslavia. The Cubans even sent their own military personnel to fight alongside their Angolan allies. The FNLA adopted more of an African nationalist approach, initially devoting itself to the Bakongo and gaining the support of Mobutu Sese Seko in neighboring Zaire in the process. With the Cold War in full swing, any enemy of communism was a de facto friend of the West, and the United States lent their support to the FNLA once fellow NATO member Portugal was out of the picture. UNITA, with its main base of support among the Ovimbundu, was left-leaning like the MPLA and nationalist like the FNLA, but could find little common ground with either. Following the Sino-Soviet split at the end of the 1950s, the People's Republic of China was keen to fight a Cold War of its own, backing UNITA in opposition to the Russians. This led to the adoption of Maoist principles within the group during the ensuing civil war. South Africa also supported UNITA with their own military units. The War of Independence had liberated the country of Angola, but it had broken it too. Tens of thousands of Angolans, many of them civilians, lay dead after only 12 months of fighting. By the time the Carnation Revolution rolled around, the death toll ran into the hundreds of thousands. But the leaders of a factionalized Angola were not finished with the bloodshed just yet. It was the MPLA that struck first, seizing control of the capital at Luanda in the wake of the Portuguese withdrawal. They declared independence and installed a new Angolan leader, President Agostinho Neto. The FNLA was not going to stand by and let this happen, and they launched an assault on the MPLA's Luanda base, their confidence buoyed by the fact that Mobutu and Zaire had backed their horse. It would not be enough. With Soviet support, thousands of Cuban troops and Yugoslav warships the MPLA defeated the FNLA, potentially knocking one of the three key powers out of the conflict. But the FNLA was not quite done. UNITA were far weaker militarily than the MPLA, but they had the greatest popular support. In an effort to save their own skin and keep themselves in the fight, the FNLA's leaders established a second capital with UNITA at Huambo, and sent out pleas to South Africa to help them overcome Soviet and MPLA control in the region. South Africa heeded the call, but by the mid-1970s, the country's apartheid regime was isolated on the international stage, and what assistance they could provide would be limited. The MPLA understood this, and they seized their chance. As international units and advisors drained out of the country, only the Cubans and the South Africans remained. Soon, it would only be the Cubans, as they made the weight of numbers and the power of the Comintern tell in their operations against isolated South African troops. By 1977, the MPLA had achieved almost complete control, establishing a Marxist-Leninist government and stacking another piece upon the teetering seesaw of international Cold War politics. Not all members of the MPLA welcomed the party's new political identity. Nito Alves, a high-ranking party member with huge support, demanded Neto align Angola more closely with the Soviets. Neto, accusing his opponent of destabilizing party unity, held a vote. Alves and his supporters, known as Nitistas, were dismissed. On the night of May 27, 1977, soldiers loyal to Alves launched an audacious raid on Sao Paulo prison, freeing 150 Natista prisoners. Next, they took control of the radio station, announcing the coup that was taking place to the people of Angola. From here, they swept through Luanda, kidnapping generals and officials and commandeering the presidential palace, although Neto was not there. But the government's forces had already begun their counter-offensive. As it dawned on them that the coup was about to fail, the Natistas took their fury out on their prisoners, murdering 6 government and military officials before Cuban units restored government control. In the weeks that followed, the MPLA exacted bloody revenge on supporters of Alves, or simply those they suspected of being supporters. Around 2,000 of the suspected Natistas were murdered during this act of retribution. At some time during this carnage, somewhere, no one is quite sure, Nito Alves himself was captured and killed. His coup attempt was unsuccessful, and he paid the ultimate price. Neto died in 1979, and José Eduardo dos Santos took over as president of Angola. After 2 years of Marxist-Leninist rule, the country's economy was struggling, kept alive primarily by its oil production and its international support from nations within Moscow's sphere of influence. While MPLA solidified its power, the FNLA was fading away. The UNITA, on the other hand, was growing stronger, becoming the main opponent of Dos Santos's Luanda-based government. South Africa, perhaps still smarting from their defeats in the 70s, or maybe just worried about the prospect of a Soviet bloc power in southwestern Africa, got back on the offensive in a big way, supporting their allies in the UNITA. The South African Defence Force raided Cunene province in the south of Angola on May 12, 1980, and then again in Cuando-Cubango province on May 21st. The MPLA was enraged, levelling accusations of atrocities against UNITA and South Africa and threatening a robust response. South Africa was unmoved, and on June 7th, they made an astonishing move. Attacking through Namibia, South African forces launched a double-pronged assault, knocking out the Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO command center in the north of the country, and then carrying on with the full-scale invasion of Cunene and Cuando-Cubango. UNITA, along with South Africa, now had real swaths of territory in the south of Angola. The international community was outraged, but few nations took any meaningful action. The exceptions were Cuba, who sent yet more troops across the Atlantic to Angola, bolstering their ranks to 40,000 by 1985, and Zaire, who reinforced their support for the MPLA. On the international stage, outrage does not last long. By 1985, the USA, displeased by the ongoing existence of a Marxist-Leninist state in Africa's southwest, stepped up things a gear, providing military aid to UNITA for the first time. Meanwhile, the MPLA had rebranded, becoming the MPLA-PT, the Partido Trabalhista or Labour Party, and by 1987 they were back on the offensive. A war that was now 12 years old was about to step up in intensity once again. 2 years on, and the two invaded provinces were still in rebel hands. The MPLA now had their own formal armed forces, the FAPLA, and retaking these provinces had become top priority. So far, they'd had no luck. Throughout 1986, attempts were made to push the South Africans out of the country and to wipe out UNITA forces at Cuando Kubanga and Cunene. Now in August 1987, the FAPLA was preparing to throw everything at their enemies and bring Cuando Kubanga back under MPLA control for good. 8 brigades would advance on 2 fronts, pushing the rebels back to Mavinga while driving insurgents out of Moxico province to the east. If all went to plan, the next objective would be Chamba and the UNITA headquarters. But all did not go to plan, and what followed would be the biggest battle on African soil since El Alamein. For UNITA, the objective was survival. For the South Africans, it was to assist their UNITA allies and prevent the SWAPO from gaining a foothold in the south of Angola. For both, losing valuable ground to the FAPLA was unthinkable. As the FAPLA troops advanced in the town of Ciute Quanaval, a key objective on the way to Mavinga, the South African Defence Forces came out to stop them. The SADF units hit FAPLA hard. They'd been humiliated the previous decade, but that wasn't going to happen again. This time, it was the government forces and their Cuban allies who would turn tail and run, leaving thousands of their comrades dead on the battlefield behind them. Skirmishes around the area continued into 1988, and both sides claimed some form of victory. Ultimately, it was UNITA and South Africa who won the day, achieving their own objectives while the MPLA missed out on most of theirs. What was supposed to be an ultimate assault on rebel positions in the south had failed, and the rebels had earned themselves a seat at the negotiating table. In 1988, delegations from Cuba, from the MPLA, and from South Africa met in New York to agree on a deal. Watching South Africa and Cuba at the table, US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Chester Croker reportedly said, was like watching 2 scorpions in a bottle. Despite the obvious animosity, both the Cubans and the South Africans were eager to achieve a mutually acceptable climb down from conflict. Cuba had lost a huge number of its soldiers in Angola, while South Africa was alarmed by the rising stakes of the situation. The accords were signed on December 22nd, and Cuba withdrew its forces the following January. South Africa had already withdrawn from Angola and would withdraw too from Namibia under the terms of the agreement. Namibia would gain total independence from South Africa the following year. By June of 1989, Dos Santos and his UNITA counterpart, Jonas Savimbi, would themselves get around the table and attempt to thresh out a ceasefire deal. An agreement was reached, but quickly fell apart. The war might have lost its international aspects, but the civil conflict was still far from over. The 1990s ushered in a new world. East Germany had rejoined with the West. The Soviet Union disintegrated. South African apartheid drew toward its close. And yet a conflict that had been a key proxy in the now thawing Cold War still lingered on in this new decade. By 1991, both sides were weary, and at a Portuguese-mediated conference in Lisbon, both Dos Santos and Savimbi signed the Bicesse Accords to bring this bitter and devastating war to an end. The 1992 elections that followed could have been a new dawn for Angola, but the vote was split. While the MPLA claimed almost half of the ballots, no side achieved the 50% mandate. A second round of elections was called, and UNITA, proclaiming their suspicion over free and fair practices, sent their vice president, Jeremiah Chitunda, to Luanda in an attempt to stop what they believed was MPLA manipulation. But before the second round of voting could begin, chaos erupted in Luanda. MPLA forces and their supporters launched a devastating assault on UNITA positions. Local police began moving from house to house in search of UNITA voters, while civilians, freshly armed by MPLA units in the city, began murdering those suspected of UNITA sympathies. The traditional cultural divisions between the two factions gave the violence a racial aspect, and the dead were predominantly members of the Omvembundu and Bakongo ethnic groups. In what would become dubbed as the Halloween Massacre, as many as 30,000 people lost their lives, including a number of leading UNITA officials. Chitunda himself would be carjacked in Luanda on November 2nd. He and his UNITA colleague Elias Salupeto Peña were dragged from their car and summarily executed by the roadside. After the aborted elections, the already horrifying violence managed to find another gear. It's estimated that those killed 18 months following the 1992 elections numbered roughly half of all those killed in the previous 16 years of war. Cities fell under siege, shells struck military positions and civilian communities indiscriminately, and both sides committed atrocity after atrocity. In 1994, the Lusaka Protocol sought to affirm the Bicesse Accords and bring an end to the suffering, but Savimbi refused to attend personally, and the resulting ceasefire soon fell through. An enormous UN peacekeeping mission, costing over $1.5 billion, attempted to enforce the protocol, but bloody skirmishes and horrendous acts of violence remained common throughout the 90s. But with international support now non-existent and the Cold War now a fading memory, how were UNITA able to afford such a drawn-out conflict? One of the many disturbing aspects of the war was the trade in blood diamonds, precious stones mined in areas controlled by UNITA and sold on legitimate international markets to whoever could afford them. The British firm, De Beers, signed a contract in 1990 enabling them to handle diamonds mined in Angola and pumping billions of dollars into the country in the process. Even when international sanctions bit down, UNITA was still able to generate huge profits from illicit diamond trading. Between 1992 and 1998, UNITA made at least $3.92 billion from these trades, giving them almost unlimited coffers with which to prosecute a seemingly endless war. Even unlimited funds cannot defeat death. On February 22, 2002, Jonas Savimbi was killed at the hands of government troops during an engagement on Moxico. His successor, Antonio Dembo, had been wounded along with Savimbi and led the faction for only 12 days before his death on March 3rd. With Paulo Lukamba Gato now in charge of UNITA, and with the focal point of opposition now dead, the Angolan government softened their approach. Representatives of the MPLA and UNITA met in Kasamba and a ceasefire was agreed. A memorandum of understanding was followed on April 4th, and the decades-long conflict came to an end. Both UNITA and the MPLA remain to this day as two of the main political parties in a democratic Angola. But this is far from the only legacy of this devastating conflict. 1/3 of Angolans, some 4.28 million people, were displaced during the bloodshed. In 2003, it was estimated that 80% of Angolans did not have access to basic medical care, and 60% had no access to water. Child mortality rates went through the roof, life expectancy plummeted to less than 40 years, and 100,000 children were torn apart from their families. The material of war still litters the landscape. Between 2018 and 2021 alone, 156 people died in explosions caused by landmines and other ordnance left over from the Civil War, with countless more injured. Those fortunate enough to survive are left to fend for themselves with no support from the government. What began as a cry for dignity and self-determination in the face of colonial exploitation quickly morphed into a hell that would last for almost half a century. Millions of Angolans lived and died during this period of conflict, knowing nothing other than war for their entire lives. Communities turned on one another along ideological and racial lines, and now must live together, side by side, in a new Angola. It's more than 20 years since the end of the Angolan Civil War, but the scars are still visible upon this country, upon her land, and, most distressingly, upon her people.
For nearly 140 years, the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo have suffered. From the horrors of colonialism to a series of bloody civil wars via a brutal Western-backed dictatorship, the story of this country in Central Africa is a grim one, but it needs to be told. What we now call the Democratic Republic of Congo has had many names over the past century and a half. But again and again, it has been failed by those who were supposed to be its protectors, both by the so-called peacekeepers of the international community and by the Congolese politicians who promised to lead the nation to prosperity. On this episode of Untangling Africa, we turn our attention to Congo and to one of the most tragic tales in the history of the continent, a tale that is sadly not yet at an end. This is Untangling Africa, and this is the Congo crisis, where the dream of independence gave way to Africa's longest period of conflict and turmoil. Of the many brutal accounts to emerge from the European colonization of Africa, some of the most barbaric originate from the very heart of the continent, from the Congo Free State. Congo was not a typical European colony. This was no extension of political power or economic policy stretching from Western Europe into the lands of Africa. Instead, this was something different. Congo existed in a personal union with Belgium, a colony not of the state of Belgium but rather of her ruler, King Leopold II, who took the territory for his own. For 23 years, Leopold did what he wanted with his personal empire. He ran the economy into the ground, brutalized the local population, waged wars, and executed neighboring leaders. Under Leopold's rule, the Congolese were subjected to sickening abuse and persecution. Draconian penalties underpinned law and order, and stories of the armed units of the Force Publique requiring a human hand for every bullet expended to prove the bullet had not been wasted have become part of the fabric of the region's ugly colonial history. Finally, in 1908, Leopold lost control of his personal kingdom, the kingdom he had never personally visited. The Congo Free State was taken over by Belgium, becoming the Belgian Congo and falling into line with other European holdings in the region like German East Africa or the French Congo, exploited, inhibited, but still just about functioning as a state. And yet still, the scars of Leopold were visible upon the land. The ghost of the former personal emperor who had died in 1909 still loomed large. The nation, or nations, of Congo had been broken by Leopold, and the seeds of violence had been sown so abundantly that it was only a matter of time before they burst through the soil and bore fruit. But other seeds had been sown too. In the final years of Leopold's grip on the Congo, the Belgian company Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, also known as the UMHK, or the Mining Union of Upper Katanga in English, was granted the exclusive right to mine copper in the Katanga region in the southwest of the Congo. In 1914, as part of the newly formed colony of the Belgian Congo, Katanga would gain province status, becoming an economic powerhouse for the state. 33.7% of the total revenue of Congo came from copper mining in Katanga, which was controlled exclusively by the UMHK. Even after Congo was absorbed into Belgium's empire, the legacy of Leopold II remained in the form of the mining interests granted during his personal rule. And even after Congo gained independence in 1960, the Belgian government would be reluctant to give up its stake in such a lucrative enterprise. The UMHK had regional power, it had money, it had the backing of Europe. To say the Second World War hit Europe hard is a massive understatement. The continent was crippled by the conflict that ripped through it from 1939 to 1945, and in the decades that followed, those countries that still held lingering colonial power struggled to keep it together. One of those countries was Belgium, and this had a significant effect on the political landscape of the Belgian Congo. By the 1950s, change was in the air, and revolution was being discussed in alarmingly real terms. As the decade progressed, colonial administrators found themselves struggling to contain the fire of local dissent. When the government back in Belgium turned up the pressure, local administrators began to manipulate the facts until flashpoints and violent incidents simply went unreported. The Belgian Congo was spiraling toward chaos, but Belgium herself remained blissfully unaware of the true gravity of the situation. On January 4th, 1959, Belgium became very, very aware. Rioting broke out in the colony's capital, Leopoldville. another legacy of the former king. 34 Congolese were killed after an attempted meeting of the anti-colonial political party Alliance des Congo, or ABCO, was broken up by Belgian forces. The bloodshed in the capital lit the fuse for revolution across the country. Flashpoints grew in frequency, and the Belgian administrators, their hands tied by the bureaucratic process, could not effectively punish those involved. This emboldened the local masses, and when the Parti Solidaire Africain emerged in May 1959, it rapidly gained support. The Belgian government now had a simple choice: either give the people the elections they craved or lose control of the region altogether. But even at this late stage, the colonial authorities had more tricks up their sleeve. They called an election but backed their own puppet candidates in an attempt to placate the people. The Parti Solidaire Africain, now allied with the ABCO, was outraged, and this meant the people were outraged too. A boycott was called. The Belgians responded by arresting men who refused to vote, but their efforts were in vain. Turnout among white Belgians was high, but in Congolese areas it was woeful. In the Kwilu region, a little more than 1% of those eligible actually voted in the populated Kwilu district, while voting numbers were somewhat higher elsewhere. Belgium was forced back to the negotiation table with its tail between its legs. New elections were called. This time, they would be fair and free, and the Parti Solidaire Africain would be involved. There was only one outcome, and on June 30th, 1960, Congo declared independence from Belgium. From the private plaything of a European king, to an official colony, to an independent state, all in a little over half a century, but still the strife and violence that had plagued Congo for so long refused to go away. The cracks in the new state began to form almost immediately. Up to now, we've talked about the people of the Congo as a homogeneous whole, but in truth, this is far too simplistic. There are more than 200 distinct ethnic groups inhabiting the vast Congo region, each with its own culture, history, and outlook. This enormous diversity fractured the Parti Solidaire Africain, and local disagreements effectively killed the party right on the cusp of a new age. According to the journalist David Reed, reporting from Congo for the US News and World Report, the dream of independence and autonomy for those who had lived through decades of colonial oppression quickly died. African officials suddenly were big shots, rode around in fancy cars, and took over elaborate homes, Reed wrote. In short, they replaced a white aristocracy with a black aristocracy. But there was more to come. The Force Publique had provided the military power in the region since the days of Leopold II, and even in the days following independence, consisted of black Congolese soldiers serving under white Belgian officers. When the African soldiers of the Belgian officered Force Publique saw what was happening, Reed added, they wanted their share. On July 8th, barely a week after independence, they mutinied and a fresh crisis erupted. Belgium, desperate to evacuate their citizens amid reports of violence and retribution from soldiers and civilians alike, sent in special forces units to bring Belgians back to Europe. Not all Belgians were so quick to abandon Congo, however. The UMHK still controlled the mining copper in the southern province of Katanga, and the UMHK in turn was controlled by European interests, chiefly Belgian interests, but also British and French too. The lure of mineral wealth, of money, proved strong. The UMHK and its European backers began to conspire, working with a local Katangan politician to protect their massive investment in the south of the new nation. This politician was Moise Tshombe, a man who has since become synonymous with the unfolding Congo crisis. On July 11th, less than 2 weeks after independence and only 3 days after the Force Publique mutiny, Tshombe announced the formation of another state, the independent states of Katanga. Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom did not publicly acknowledge this new state, but this did not stop them from backing Katanga financially and militarily. Flouting UN regulations, European soldiers even joined Tshombe's army as mercenaries. In a matter of weeks, Congo had already begun to disintegrate, and Katanga, with powerful European friends, looked like it would be sticking around. History is never simple. To write Katanga's secession off as a purely financial move, a power play from neo-colonialists in Brussels, Paris and London, is just too easy. Was Tshombe simply a puppet for a new form of economic imperialism? Francis Terry McNamara, who served as an officer at the US consul in Elizabethville, also known as Lubumbashi in Katanga during the crisis, didn't think so. Tshombe was a man of great charm and intelligence, a good leader. The idea that he was just a creature of neo-colonial influences is a gross exaggeration and misunderstanding of fact, McNamara said in a 1993 interview. Like most African political leaders, his support was tribally based. He openly opposed the central government. In the beginning, he was manipulated to a degree by the Belgians, the French and the British, but they didn't create his authentic local rapport. People's only real identification is still with tribe and region. Congo is an artificial creation of the colonial powers. European nations protecting their business interests, local ethnic and tribal groups dissatisfied with the new Congolese order. McNamara's words really highlight the complexity of the situation here in Central Africa at the beginning of the 1960s. But this complexity doesn't end here. Along with tribal divisions, there were ideological divisions too, which would put Congo at the heart of simmering international tensions. The independent Congo state had been declared after democratic elections and the reluctant agreement of the former colonial powers. In the eyes of the world, this was a legitimate nation, one that deserved the support and assistance afforded to other nations with a seat at the table of the United Nations. Patrice Lumumba, a democratically elected prime minister of the fledgling country under President Joseph Kasavubu, appealed to the UN for help in ending Katangan secession and halting the slide toward all-out war. When the UN refused, Lumumba made a decision that would cost him his office and ultimately his life, and would add a whole new international dimension to the conflict. He turned to the Soviet Union. Lumumba never referred to himself as a socialist or a communist. He was an African nationalist at heart and avowedly so. But by looking to the USSR at the time of enormous tension between the West and the communist bloc, Lumumba's actions spoke louder than his words. After a string of communist victories in Asia, the West was not about to let a vast swath of Central Africa fall under the influence of Moscow. In one sense, Lumumba's gamble paid off. The UN and the United States, alarmed by the idea of Soviet weapons in an African civil war, sprung into action. In February, the UN passed Security Council Resolution 161, authorizing all appropriate measures to prevent civil war in the country. Attempts by the UN to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis were dealt a crushing blow that September when Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld's plane crashed in suspicious circumstances in Zambia, on its way to a secret rendezvous with Tshombe, killing all on board. The green light was essentially lit for international military action in Katanga. The Katangan state, even with its unofficial European mercenaries, could not hold out. By January 1963, Katanga's secession was quashed, and Tshombe rejoined Kasavubu's government as prime minister later in 1964. In almost all other senses though, Lumumba's gamble did not pay off, not even close. Lumumba was deposed as Prime Minister of Congo in November 1960 after only months in office. He would not live to see UN intervention in his country as he was murdered in custody in 1961 before Resolution 161 had passed. The death of Patrice Lumumba has been the source of much controversy and conjecture. What's almost certain is this. On January 17th, the deposed Prime Minister, along with two associates, faced a firing squad on the grounds of a private villa in Katanga. The three men were shot to death, their bodies buried in shallow graves before being exhumed, dismembered, and dissolved in sulfuric acid. What's less certain is how this came about. Belgian officials likely oversaw the execution while Katangan authorities likely carried it out. At the same time, it is known that CIA agents made attempts on Lumumba's life in the period of tumult following his election, while a memo from the British Foreign Office suggested removing Lumumba from the scene by killing him. Whatever involvement outside elements had in Lumumba's death, by 1965, the civil war was declared over and Congo was unified under a new leader. The age of Mobutu had begun. Colonel Joseph Désiré Mobutu was a master operator and strategist. He knew which horse to back and he knew how to get what he wanted. In the summer of 1960, Mobutu offered his tacit support to President Kasavubu in his attempts to get rid of Lumumba. When Lumumba raised an army to depose the president in September 1960, Mobutu struck and seized power. 5 months later, in another strategic gear change, Mobutu handed power back to Kasavubu, who placed Mobutu at the head of the armed forces. In the bloody chess game that was Congolese politics in the 1960s, this was a significant blunder. By 1965, President Kasavubu was vulnerable and Mobutu moved again. He seized power in a coup and retook the presidency. He would remain there through a combination of international brinksmanship and brutal political oppression for over 30 years. While in power, Mobutu would change his name. Joseph Désiré was no more. Mobutu Sese Seko was in charge now. Or, to give him his full title, Mobutu Sese Seko Koko Ngbendu Wazabanga, the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, will go from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. The permanent return of Mobutu Sese Seko, the all-powerful warrior, to power in Congo was the first in a string of major failures from the United Nations. In 1963, after the reintegration of Katanga into Congo, it was announced that the UN's presence in the country was to be phased out. In the months leading up to their withdrawal in 1964, the priority of the UN forces shifted to the retaining of the Congolese military, with a view of achieving long-term stability in the region. This military was under the direct control of Commander-in-Chief Mobutu, and this retraining effectively gave Mobutu the tools to seize power in the 1965 coup. What followed was decades of conflict and misery for the people of Congo. First came violent mutiny in 1966, when 2,000 Katanga gendarmes loyal to Chombe, now in exile in Spain, rebelled against the Kisangani. A year later, when Chombe was kidnapped and put under arrest in Algeria, a second mutiny broke out in Kisangani. Both were brutally put down. A third rebellion in 1967 was moderately more successful, but still ended in bloody struggle and significant loss of life. In 1971, Mobutu rebranded Congo as Zaire, seeking to create an authentic national identity that all Congolese could rally around. For most in the country, however, this authenticity meant very little, as Mobutu's regime plundered the land and crippled the economy of the mineral-rich nation. With all other parties outlawed, Mobutu's Popular Movement of Revolution, or MPR, was unchallenged, and the dictator was free to run his own economic strategies, often at the expense of the nation as a whole. Outside of Zaire, however, there was opposition. The Congolese National Liberation Front, or FLNC, was active in neighboring Angola and gathering significant strength. In 1977 and 1978, the FLNC launched 2 incursions into Katanga, by now known as Shaba. Morocco intervened on the side of Mobutu in 1977 and helped push back the invaders. In 1978, France got invoked, assisting Mobutu's forces as they retook control of Shaba. In both cases, the loss of life was staggering. The invasions may have been unsuccessful, but they gave Zairians something to cling to. Anti-Mobutu sentiment grew in the country through the 1980s and seemed to have some effect, as the MPR government found itself under increasing pressure to liberalize and democratize Zaire. While the Cold War raged, Western nations opted to turn a blind eye to the abuses of power and rampant mismanagement taking place in Zaire. But with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1989, the tide began to turn. Suddenly, a strong, Western-aligned Zaire was of little importance to the Americans and to the European Union, and former backers in the US, France, and Belgium began to push for democratic change. Now, some 3 decades after the Belgian colonial administration found themselves running out of options, it was Mobutu who had no choice. In 1990, Mobutu declared Zaire a multi-party state, but just a month later, scores of students were massacred following a protest at the University of Lubumbashi. Tiring of Mobutu, France cut back on its aid payments to Zaire in 1991. For around 100 days in 1994, Hutu nationalists rampaged through Rwanda, murdering up to 800,000 people, mainly of Tutsi ethnicity. The Rwandan genocide, its horrors, and the failure of the UN to meaningfully prevent the atrocities that took place during this period are well documented and are subjects for another video. While scenes of desperate refugees fleeing across the Zairean border shocked onlookers from across the world, few actually wondered what these refugees were fleeing into. Far less well documented are the tribal conflicts and sickening bloodshed that were ripping through Zaire in those years. Many of these refugees who sought safety and successfully made it through to Zaire had only traded one set of killers for another. From the beginning of the 1990s through to the Rwandan genocide and beyond, hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in tribal conflicts throughout Zaire, as the country descended into chaos once again. The UN condemned the human rights situation in 1997, but once again did essentially nothing to protect those in harm's way. For Mobutu, the end was at hand. The emergence of a multi-party system had not gone well for the self-styled all-powerful warrior, and there's now a real opposition to the leader and his ruling MPR party. Opposition that spilled over into the Second Congo Civil War in 1996. But Mobutu was facing another threat: cancer. With his health ailing and his enemies circling, Mobutu sought treatment in France in December 1997. While he was out of the country, rebel forces struck. The country fell within months, and the rebel leader Laurent Kabila declared victory on March 29th. Mobutu fled the Zaire in May, entering exile in Morocco, and succumbed to his cancer that September. The UN's failure in the Congo crisis was as complex as it was disastrous. But what actually went wrong? Just like in Rwanda in 1994, the United Nations can be accused of inaction in Congo in 1960. Appeals for assistance from a democratically elected leader went unanswered, driving a fledgling nation elsewhere for assistance and dragging the conflict onto the world stage as the Cold War rapidly threatened to become hot. Was the United Nations manipulated by other parties? Possibly. Soviet involvement in the Congo crisis certainly caught the attention of the United States and other Western governments. The murder of Patrice Lumumba in 1961 was a catalyst for the United Nations Resolution 161. But the allegations of Western involvement in this killing remain highly suspicious. UN and US forces were brutally successful in Katanga in 1963, but at other times they were found lacking. In 2004, a UN peacekeeping detachment in the eastern DRC/Rwandan borderlands was ordered to withdraw by Rwandan army units. Despite their mandate, the peacekeepers withdrew, underlying how toothless the United Nations forces have been at various points in this seemingly endless cycle of war. It's also important to remember Dag Hammarskjöld. It's been alleged that the UN Secretary General's fatal plane crash in 1961 was not an accident at all, but rather a planned assassination. This hasn't been confirmed, but a reported explosion on the plane shortly before it came down suggests a possible intentional killing. If this were true, it demonstrates the lengths the UN's enemies were willing to go to end foreign intervention in the region. UN forces preparing to leave Congo in 1963 turned their attention toward training and preparing the Congolese military. This essentially gave Colonel Mobutu the very means he needed to seize power when the time was right. Some of the accusations made against UN forces are far darker than inaction, error, or manipulation. In 2008, it emerged that 150 allegations of sexual abuse had been brought against UN forces in Congo. According to then UN Secretary General himself, Ban Ki-moon, there was clear evidence that acts of gross misconduct have taken place. Even in this century, the people of Congo are being brutalized by those who were sent there to protect them. You might have spotted something just then. The dates. Mobutu died in 1997, ousted by a similar rebellion to the one that had swept him to power. A new government was formed under Laurent Kabila. Zaire became the Democratic Republic of Congo, which it remains to this day. And yet, our timeline does not end here. These incidents in 2004 and 2008 are not isolated. They're products of yet another cycle of war that struck the country after Mobutu was gone. In 1998, the Third Congo Civil War broke out when Laurent Kabila ordered all Rwandan and Ugandan forces and government officials out of the country following his victory the previous year. These Rwandans and Ugandans, once allies of Kabila, did not leave. Instead, they joined up with rebel groups inside the DRC and mounted an armed insurrection against the Congolese leader. Over 5 years of war that involved 10 African countries, an estimated 5.4 million people died. This was the bloodiest conflict since the Second World War. Even now, Congo's torment is not yet complete. As recently as 2022, armed groups were still struggling for control in areas of the DRC, and the situation remains desperate. For the people of Central Africa, the misery that began in the 1800s now spans 3 centuries, and it shows no sign of coming to an end. For the United Nations, the wounds of past mistakes are being reopened, and the organization's great shame lingers on. We can only hope for something better in the future. The people of the Democratic Republic of Congo certainly deserve it. In what we consider a classic move by the British Empire, the Brits just went ahead and kept the East African state of Eritrea after they defeated the Italians there in World War II. After the war, when the Eritreans were calling for independence, the British pulled another classic move and basically ignored them. That is until the United Nations stepped in. With help from the UN, Eritrea became a constituent state under the Federation of Ethiopia and Eritrea in 1952. Though over the next decade, the Eritreans grew tired of this arrangement and fought for their independence yet again, only for Ethiopia to annex Eritrea in 1962. This set in motion a Cold War-era conflict that would rage for almost 30 years, the Eritrean War of Independence. Spearheading its push for freedom was the Eritrean Liberation Front, which, for all its enthusiasm, was unfortunately built on a poor foundation. Fighting within the ELF led to its fragmentation and, in turn, creation of the Marxist-Leninist Eritrean People's Liberation Front, or EPLF, not to mention the 3,000 who lost their lives when these two organizations went head-to-head. What brought them together again was remembering they had a common enemy in the Ethiopian government, which had problems of its own. In 1974, the Provisional Military Government of Socialist Ethiopia, or simply the Derg, overthrew the Ethiopian government and established a Marxist-Leninist state that they were simply unable to sustain on their own. As such, they opened their doors to the Soviet Union. Conversely, the United States became Eritrea's main squeeze, despite the fact that the EPLF was a Marxist-Leninist organization. By 1977, the EPLF, still friendly enough with the ELF, were spearheading Eritrea's independence movement, having seized all but 3 of Eritrea's cities and towns. By taking advantage of the concurrent Somali offensive on Ethiopia, the freedom fighters were primed to achieve their goal. Their strategy, however, was thwarted by the Soviet Union, Yemen and Cuba, who provided the Ethiopians with the weapons and manpower, including as many as 18,000 Cubans, to stave off the Somalis. Armed to the teeth, the Ethiopians drove the Eritreans back and almost completely shattered them in the siege of Barentu and the Battle of Masasawa. But the Eritrean freedom fighters were not wholly undone. They continued to harry the Ethiopians guerrilla style until the 1988 Battle of Alphabet, where they turned the tides of the war by forcing the Ethiopian army to flee the Alphabet and its surrounds. Soon after, the Soviets withdrew their support, putting Ethiopia on its back foot and allowing the Eritreans to reclaim their war-torn nation. Over the next 5 years, the United States helped Ethiopia and Eritrea negotiate peace, under which Eritrea finally gained its hard-earned independence.
To put it in perspective, as many as 160,000 Eritrean soldiers and 40,000 civilians perished in the war, as opposed to as many as 1 million Ethiopians, according to an American case study. The African continent was an absolute hotbed of fighting during the Cold War. As the old colonial empires of Europe receded, two new empires reached out across the globe to take their place, championing new world orders based on either crony capitalism or militant communism. One place this conflict infected was Southwest Africa, now Namibia, where the South African Defence Force fought a 23-year-long war that, in the minds of many, has been forgotten. In this video, we tell the story of the South African Border War and Namibia's struggle for independence. Like so many modern conflicts with colonial origins, the best place for us to start is the end of the First World War. Southwest Africa had been a German colony until 1915, when it was invaded by South Africa, which was then a British dominion. After the war, the region became a League of Nations mandate. However, as South Africa was a powerful and developed neighbour, they retained administrative control over the territory. When the UN superseded the League of Nations in 1945, they requested the South African government apply for a trusteeship over the territory. The South Africans one-upped them, asking to annex it instead. The UN was pretty much like, no, you can't do that, but South Africa did it anyway. By the late 1940s, Southwest Africa was effectively run as a South African province. But what did this actually mean? Apartheid. The South African government exported one of the world's most oppressive regimes, one that Nelson Mandela described as diabolical in its detail, inescapable in its reach, and overwhelming in its power, to their newly gained territory of Southwest Africa. This worked in favour of the few thousand German and Boer settlers, but seriously screwed over the other 90-odd% of the territory's inhabitants, the indigenous Africans. Every aspect of their lives was regulated, scrutinised, and policed with extreme prejudice by their new overlords. The thing with systematic, institutionalised oppression on a national scale is people don't like it. As the 1950s wore on into the 1960s, Southwest African resistance groups started popping up across the territory. They staged demonstrations and boycotts, and the police usually responded with bullets. One of the main resistance groups was the Southwest African People's Organisation, or SWAPO. Their goal was to take back land and industry from the occupying South Africans and enact sweeping welfare, healthcare, and educational reforms. The US was on good terms with South Africa, so they did their bro a solid and declared SWAPO communist. When the real communists over in the USSR found out, they were more than happy to send military aid to Southwest Africa's border regions to prepare SWAPO for a grand revolutionary struggle. Realizing very quickly that a side had been picked for them, SWAPO fell in with the communists, although they didn't have much of a choice. With the aid of Soviet instructors, SWAPO developed a potent guerrilla force known as the Liberation Army, or SWALA. From September 1965, SWALA guerrillas began infiltrating Southwest Africa from secret bases in Zambia. By August 1966, the South African Defence Force were hot on their trail, tracking the insurgents to their base at Omugulog-Wombashe. The inexperienced insurgents were taken by surprise by an elite force of SADF paratroopers and police. For the South Africans, Operation Blue Wildebeest, as it was known, was a minor counterinsurgency mission, but for SWAPO, it was the start of a long war for independence. The South African Border War, as it was known in Pretoria, had now begun. With increasing conflict on the border, the South Africans cracked down even harder on the Namibian population. This, in turn, fed more military recruits to SWALA, leading to more fighting, and the cycle continued. But even with their ranks swelling, and even with new armories from the Soviet Union, SWALA couldn't take on the SADF in a conventional battle, so they got asymmetric. After renaming themselves the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, the freedom fighters got to work planting landmines on SADF patrol routes.
This tactic was super effective against the lightly armoured paratroopers and police. PLAN also launched assaults on lightly defended regional police stations and installations. In January 1973, 50 insurgents armed with machine guns, rockets and mortars obliterated an entire police base in the Caprivi, now Zambezi, region near Zambia. Despite being veterans of the Rhodesian Bush War, the police defenders were soundly defeated. When reports got back to Pretoria, the South Africans were furious. If the insurgents wanted a fight, the South African army was going to give it to them. Between 1973 and 1974, the SADF's budget increased by 150%. 15,000 troops rolled out along Southwest Africa's northern border, clearing and demarcating it as the cut line. SADF soldiers patrolled the cut line 24/7, looking for signs of infiltration from Angola. But Angola was having troubles of its own. In April 1974, Portugal's authoritarian dictatorship was deposed and its colonial holdings were set free. Three groups, UNITA, FNLA, and MPLA, rose to fill the power vacuum left in Angola. The MPLA was aligned with the Soviets and received huge amounts of weapons from them. This gave them the edge they needed to push UNITA and FNLA out of Angola's capital. In response, the CIA did what it does best and started funneling weapons to the FNLA. By 1975, things were seriously heating up. For the SADF, all communists looked the same, so they lumped the MPLA in the enemy pile with the PLAN. They then disguised 2,500 soldiers as mercenaries and sent them over the border to fight alongside UNITA, commanded by confirmed Giga Chad Jonas Savimbi. They had one goal. But the MPLA had friends, and in November 1975, 12,000 Cuban soldiers showed up with heavy weapons and a full Soviet flotilla. This massive communist force crushed the CIA-backed FNLA and Savimbi's UNITA. The South Africans were forced to pull back to the border. The MPLA took Angola, and the Soviet-backed PLAN suddenly started getting a lot more help for their fight in Southwest Africa. SWAPO chief Sam Nuoma commented, "It was as if a locked door had suddenly swung open. We could at last make direct attacks across our frontier and send in forces and weapons on a large scale." PLAN guerrillas attacked the cut line regularly, but they were nearly always intercepted by small SADF patrols. The brunt of the fighting was done by these small sections, leading to this phase of the conflict becoming known as the Corporal's War. The SADF wanted to send large units over the Angolan border with armor and air support in an attempt to crush the PLAN, but the politicians were against it. The war had dragged on for over a decade now, and every time a South African body came home, it got less popular. The apartheid regime tried to sell the public on a war of communist containment, but many saw it as neo-colonial expansionism. It was getting expensive too, as South Africa had now become the primary check to communist forces backed up by the industrial might of the USSR and raw Cuban manpower. In 1978, after a spate of successful border raids by the PLAN, the SADF finally got the go-ahead to cross the border in force. As part of Operation Reindeer, 370 paratroopers of the 44th Parachute Brigade attacked the Angolan mining town of Kasinga. The soldiers had been told it was a PLAN administrative headquarters, but this is where history gets a little murky. SWAPO and the Cubans claimed that Kasinga wasn't an insurgent base, but a refugee camp that just happened to have some fighters passing through. A passing Swedish photographer noted that the camp had both facilities for refugees and a uniformed PLAN presence, insinuating that neither side was telling the whole truth. What resulted was a massacre. The SADF hit Kasinga with airstrikes, then the paratroops led a ground assault. Sources concur that they killed around 600 people. In return, the Paras only suffered 3 dead. Undoubtedly, the PLAN soldiers would have put up a stout defense,
but the fact that they only killed 3 soldiers suggests that most of those dead weren't PLAN, as South Africa claimed, but rather civilians. The international community reached a similar conclusion, and old allies like the United States and Britain openly condemned South Africa. Global opposition to apartheid was growing, and even though they were fighting the commies, no one thought the SADF were the good guys anymore. From the 70s to the late 80s, the war dragged on with no end in sight. SADF troops made repeated incursions to Angola to hunt down PLAN forces while trying to prevent those same forces doing the same to them. The Soviets refused to back down too and continued supplying top-tier weaponry to the insurgents. On the ground, the SADF were more than a match for the inexperienced insurgents, but they were spread too thinly to effectively press their advantage. There was even a short ceasefire from 1984 to 1985, but that fell apart after both sides broke the rules. The final and largest battle was fought intermittently between August 1987 and March 1988 around the city of Quito in Angola. The SADF had pushed deep into Angola and the MPLA and Cubans were pushing back. They launched a massive offensive with tanks, APCs, aircraft, and thousands of troops. In front of them stood 700 SADF soldiers, along with old mate Savimbi and over 50,000 of his boys. The communists were routed, but managed to regroup in the city. For 7 months, Savimbi's UNITA and the SADF were unable to break through the communist defenses, but the MPLA and Cubans couldn't push them back either. It was a stalemate. After back and forth fighting for nearly 2.5 decades, a stalemate was what everyone needed. It forced the major players to come to the negotiating table and sketch out a plan for peace. By 1989, the Cubans went home, the Soviets closed the armory, Angola was finally able to hold an election, which Savimbi tried to start another war over when he didn't win. The South Africans pulled back to their own border, and Namibia finally got independence. As apartheid disintegrated, Namibia was finally free to govern itself, and South Africa became far more interested in domestic affairs. The border war ended on March 21st, 1990, 23 years after it began. Washington, Bolivar, Ho Chi Minh, and Anzac, all men who did their best to free their nations from colonial pressure from the outside. While some who fought the colonial powers are remembered fondly, the period of the Yemen emergency has left a scar on the history of the Middle East that has yet to heal. From 1963 to 1967, the modern territory of Yemen was characterized by a series of insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, and political turmoil. This video will examine the causes and consequences of the Aden Emergency, as well as the strategies and tactics used by both sides during the conflict. In the 1830s, Britain was in the market for a coal depot to service their steamships as they sailed to their colony in India. They considered cities and villages all over the Red Sea and landed on Aden in Yemen. They tried to negotiate a deal with a local sultan where they would be allowed to use Aden's port, but their deal was rejected. The British, being the British, didn't let that stop them, and so they went to another sultan and managed to get him to agree to allow them to use the port. Naturally, getting their way wasn't enough, however. They wanted full control over the port but knew they couldn't take it by force without sufficient enough reason for fear of starting a conflict. Their opportunity, however, came in 1838 when a British trading ship passing by Aden was attacked by local Arab pirates who plundered the goods and sank the boats. Losing the boat was more valuable to the British than keeping what was on board. In January of 1839, they seized their opportunity to retaliate by dispatching a warship from India to attack Aden. Though the Yemeni guards tried to defend the port, the firepower of the British was overwhelming and there was little they could do. Not wanting to seem like the bad guys, they forced the Sultan they previously made a deal with to accept their protection and give them full control over Aden in exchange for a yearly fee. Faced with the famed British diplomacy, the Sultan had no choice but to agree, and Aden became the center of what was called the Aden Protectorate. From the very beginning, the British presence was met with extreme hostility from the locals, who had already faced centuries of subjugation from the Ottomans. It didn't take long for things to reach a boiling point, and in November 1839, 5,000 local tribesmen tried to retake Aden. The British fought them off and killed 200 before they decided to retreat. Still, the British realized that if their presence in Aden was to live long and prosper, they would need to make friends with the 9 tribes that surrounded the port city or deal with being attacked every few months. So they drafted what were called protection and friendship treaties with the tribes. These treaties guaranteed that the tribes would not live under British rule or be subject to British interference in their affairs. In exchange, the tribes would not be allowed to carry out business with any other non-Arab colonial powers like the French or the Dutch. Though these treaties started out as informal, the agreements were largely honoured by both sides. However, the Ottomans were not happy with the British increasing their presence in the region. They asserted that, even though they no longer had direct control over Yemen, they held sovereignty over the entire Arabian Peninsula because they were successors to Muhammad and it was their right. Regardless of the Ottomans' posturing, the British held on to their protectorate, a grip that only became stronger once the Suez Canal opened up in 1869 and Aden's strategic value skyrocketed. Thanks to the canal, Aden turned into one of the busiest trading ports in the world. It remained under the control of British India until 1937, when it was officially designated as a crown colony. After Britain finally granted independence to India in 1947, Aden became somewhat less important to it. But still, Britain held on because of the strategic value its proximity to the Suez Canal gave it. However, its influence on the canal wouldn't last forever. In order to properly tell this story, we need to turn our attention away from Yemen for a moment and look across the Red Sea to Egypt, where, in July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced his intention to nationalize the Suez Canal. This was a major blow to Britain and France. At the time, the canal was owned and operated by the Suez Canal Company, which was primarily owned by Britain and France. The former Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, once called the Suez Canal the spinal cord of the British Empire. Nasser's announcement was a major slap in the face to the colonial powers. That was the point. Nasser was one of the leaders of a massive wave of Arab nationalism that was currently sweeping across the Arab world. His only real goal was to free the Arab world of its colonial overlords who didn't care about the Arab people or their interests at all. Nasser's announcement was popular with people all over the Middle East and North Africa, and his move was perfectly legal. His government would buy out all the shareholders of the Suez Canal Company at a fair price. That was most certainly not good enough for Britain and France. Their main concerns were their ability to obtain oil from the region and stay in control. They still wanted to remain the major powers they had been historically. But with the Cold War in full swing, it was obvious that they were being dethroned in favor of the United States and the Soviet Union. The British Prime Minister at the time, Anthony Eden, equated Nasser to the likes of Hitler and Stalin, an authoritarian and a major problem that had to be dealt with, and France agreed. So, in August 1956, Britain held a conference in London which 22 nations attended to discuss the matter of the canal. 18 of the 22 countries agreed that Nasser should not take the canal, but the US emphasized that they would not support any military action against Nasser because it could push him into the hands of the USSR. With the US firmly putting its foot down, Britain and France lost any tangible support they could have hoped for. If they wanted to maintain control of the canal and get rid of Nasser, they would have to get creative. So, that's exactly what they did. They enlisted the help of Israel, a new country that was seen as illegitimate by much of the Arab world. Since Israel was Egypt's neighbor and had some semblance of a reason to invade, Britain and France had the newly formed country do just that. On October 29th, Israel landed troops in Sinai to pave a way for a ground invasion of Egypt. When questioned by the UN, they claimed that their move was in self-defense because they had been attacked by Palestinian fighters located in Sinai and Gaza. But that was a lie. Britain and France used the story as a way to step in and pretend to be the heroes. They told Israel and Egypt to stop fighting and to withdraw their troops within 24 hours or they would intervene. In doing so, they were effectively forcing the Egyptians to retreat from the Suez Canal. Israel, of course, accepted the terms, but Egypt refused, seeing right through the conspiracy. In response, the British and French navies got to work bombing Egyptian airfields and infrastructure. On November 5th, they sent paratroopers into the Suez Canal area to try and seize control. The Egyptian military was in no way prepared to face the much larger and better equipped armies of Britain and France. They did what they could to resist the aggressors, but they stood no real chance. In 2 days, 26 British and French military personnel were killed compared to 600 Egyptian, with a further 1,000 civilians killed and even more displaced as a result of the shelling. The plot to take back the canal was not a very well kept secret, and it didn't take long for the international community to figure out what was going on. Britain and France were pretty much universally condemned. What they did was so bad that the Americans and Soviets actually agreed on something. On November 7th, all sides agreed to a ceasefire. Britain and France were forced to withdraw from the canal entirely, and control of it was given back to the Egyptians. Britain was thoroughly humiliated by the whole ordeal, and their power on the world stage was significantly diminished as a result. However, on the other side, Arab nationalism was strengthened not only in Egypt but across the Arab world, just like Nasser wanted. Nasser's success in the Suez Crisis set in motion a massive wave of Arab nationalism across North Africa and the Middle East. It's unclear how much influence this wave had on the events of Yemen, but it's clear that it had at least some impact. By the late 1950s and going into the 60s, there was a lot of anti-colonial sentiment ready to boil over in Yemen. After their humiliation in Egypt, things weren't looking good for the British. Now that Britain had lost control of the Suez Canal, they doubled down on its presence in Aden, desperate to hold on to what little international power they had left. To maintain control, they began negotiating with the feuding emirs, the local tribe leaders, to get them to come together under the British Crown to form a new country called the Federation of South Arabia. At the time, Yemen was divided in two countries, North Yemen and South Yemen. South Yemen was larger and part of the British Protectorate, and that's the territory that would have become part of the Federation. Though they were able to do this successfully, it was too little too late for them because the emirs didn't reflect the will of the people. And like so many colonized people in the world during the 20th century, the people of Yemen were fed up with being subjugated by a foreign power. The British needed to retain control of the region, so they planned to take control of the Aden Trade Union Congress, or ATUC. Founded in 1956, the ATUC was created to help tame the labor unrest the region was experiencing at the time. Its Secretary General was a man named Abdullah Asnag, a massive supporter of Nasser, as well as an Arab nationalist who supported the union of all countries on the Arabian Peninsula. The union gained importance in its first few years, as it was the only nationalist organization that wasn't stamped out by the British. When the Federation of South Yemen was formed in 1962, the ATUC held a lot of influence in the National Assembly, which was dangerous for British interests in Aden. To counter it, they added the colony of Aden to the Federation in order to add more pro-British sentiment to the Assembly. But the day after the colony of Aden joined the Federation, the king of the Kingdom of Yemen, which encompassed the north and south, Muhammad al-Bod, was overthrown by rebels, plunging the region into civil war that was mostly concentrated in North Yemen. However, the conflict was so big and fierce, it bled into the Federation of South Yemen, kicking off what the British called the Aden Emergency. By 1963, there were multiple anti-British guerrilla groups forming across the country. All across South Yemen, these new guerrilla troops were diametrically opposed in their ideologies and what their visions for the future of Yemen would look like, but they agreed on one thing: they hated the British. So the various groups began to consolidate until two larger organizations formed: the National Liberation Front, NLF, and the Front for the Liberation of South Yemen, FLOSY. The NLF was a Marxist paramilitary group who were largely responsible for the downfall of the Yemenis monarchy. They were financially backed by Nasser and operated in both North and South Yemen. FLOSY, by comparison, was an Arab nationalist group created by Abdallah al-Asnag in response to the British consolidating power in the region. Like the NLF, they were backed by Nasser, but the two organizations couldn't see eye to eye. Though they teamed up to fight the British, they were often fighting amongst themselves as well because each wanted control of the region once the British were gone. The emergency officially began on December 14, 1963, when Sir Kennedy Treviskis, the British High Commissioner to Aden, had an NLF grenade launched his way as he arrived at the airport in Aden to head to London. 2 people were killed, including the Commissioner's advisor, who pushed him out of the way to save his life. A further 50 people were injured in the attack, but the Commissioner lived. The attack prompted the British to issue a state of emergency in Aden, and attacks against them by the NLF and FLOSY became more and more frequent. They were mostly focused on off-duty British policemen and officers, though attacks against other members of the British populace were also common. One such attack was at a children's party at the Royal Air Force Station in Aden in December 1964. Members of the NLF threw grenades into the party, which ultimately killed the young daughter of Air Commodore E. Saidi and wounded 4 other children. This was part of a broader series of attacks that happened around the Christmas festivities that year. On Boxing Day, Inspector Fadel Khalil of Aden Special Branch, which was part of the British military, was shot dead at the bazaar in Crater Town within Aden. For the NLF and FLOSY, anyone who worked with the British was an enemy, even fellow Arabs. Crater Town was the biggest hotspot for attacks against British officers. So much so that the British tried to stop the import of weapons into that part of Aden, but found little success. The attacks became such a problem that the British had to bring in outside help, like the 24th Infantry Brigade, which had been active in both World Wars. By 1965, the RAF station in Aden was home to 9 different squadrons, which included Hawker Hunter aircraft and ground transport units. They were used to defend the British as well as attack the NLF and FLOSY bases. The Hawker Hunters, in particular, were used to launch 60-pound high-explosive rockets. The violence from both sides continued into the following years. In January 1967, in order to try something new, the NLF instigated street riots in Aden. The police quickly lost control of the situation, so British High Commissioner Sir Richard Turnbull brought in troops to squash the riots. While they were successful in crushing the NLF's riots within 48 hours of their start, the fight wasn't over yet because FLOSY joined in and violence continued well into February. During that time, British forces opened fire 40 times and there were 60 shootings and grenade attacks against British forces. There was even an attack on Aden Airways Douglas DC-3, which was bombed mid-flight, leading to the death of everyone on board. In June 1967, Nasser accused the British of aiding Israel during the Six-Day War, which was fought between Israel and several United Arab States. That accusation was the final straw for many of the Arab people who worked for the British in Aden, and they mutinied. It started in the South Arabian Army, who set fire to their barracks and attacked a truck transporting 60 British soldiers, killing 8 of them. The SAA didn't accomplish much else before the mutiny was stopped by the British Army, but it was already too late. The Aden police quickly followed suit. They took control of their barracks in the Crater district of Aden, firing on passing British patrols from their windows. They killed 22 British soldiers and even shot down a helicopter. Their success allowed rebel forces to occupy the area, which in turn led to the Battle of Crater. Caught off guard by the occupation, British forces were ordered to withdraw from Crater. In the meantime, Royal Marines of 45 Commando took up sniping positions around the area and killed 10 armed Arab fighters. However, it had little impact, and Crater remained occupied by around 400 Arab fighters. NLF and FLOSY fighters used this time to take to the streets and engage in gun battles, along with looting, arson, and murder. To try and regain control, British forces blocked off the 2 main entrances to Crater, but they weren't able to do so until July 1967, when the 1st Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders entered Crater under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Colin Campbell Mitchell, who managed to retake the entire district overnight without casualties. But at that point in the fight, it didn't matter much. The British could see that they were fighting a losing battle as the attacks continued even after they regained control of the district, so they began to withdraw from Aden. By November 1967, they were gone for good. They left without reaching any agreement as to who would govern South Yemen upon their departure, so once they were gone, the NLF seized power and created the People's Republic of South Yemen, which would remain a sovereign state until 1990. The Aden Emergency lasted from 1963 to 1967 and saw many casualties, but it's difficult to know just how many there were. On the British side, there were anywhere between 90 to 92 deaths of soldiers, with a further 510 injured. The British also lost 17 civilians and 17 members of the local government. On the rebel side, there were an estimated 382 deaths and 1,714 injured. Despite the British desperation to maintain control in the Suez region, their power post-World War II just wasn't what it used to be, and the will of the people in Yemen was stronger.
The end of any war doesn't necessarily mean the end of all tension between belligerents. Not long after World War II wrapped up, tensions between the East and West erupted into the 45-year-long Cold War, with heavy hitters such as the USSR and the United States threatening nuclear cataclysm on a global scale. On a smaller scale, the ripples of one particularly brutal Cold War-era conflict are still felt strongly to this day. We're of course talking about the Korean War and the border incidents that followed. In this video, we're going to discuss 8 of the bloodier ones. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea. From then until 1945, when Imperial Japan surrendered to the Allies in the Second World War, Korea was under Japanese rule. With the Japanese nuked and thoroughly defeated, the USSR and US divided Korea into 2 occupation zones. The nation split along the 38th parallel into the north and south. The Soviets administered the north, the Americans the south. In 1948, with things heating up between the USSR and US, Korea's administered regions became sovereign states. The north was ruled by Kim Il-sung's communists, and the south became the anti-communist Republic of Korea. Both governments thought they were the rightful rulers of the whole Korean peninsula. Meanwhile, North Korea had been providing military assistance to the Chinese Communist Party in the 1945 to 1949 phase of the Chinese Civil War, earning themselves a place in the soon-to-be created People's Republic of China, or PRC's good books. In June 1950, North Korea's Korean People's Army, or KPA, crossed the border into South Korea and, assured the support of the PRC and USSR, went to war with the South Korean army. In response, the United Nations, most notably the United States, got involved, and this led to a 3-year conflict in which as many as 1 million soldiers and 3 million civilians lost their lives. To cut a long story even shorter, the conflict came largely to an end on the 27th of July 1953, when the UN, KPA and Chinese People's Volunteer Army signed the Korean Armistice Agreement. As part of the armistice, North and South Korea established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, across the border. This is a buffer zone between the two states. It's about 250 kilometers or 160 miles long and 4 kilometers or 2.5 miles wide, and it's not impregnable. In fact, since the DMZ's establishment more than 70 years ago, both North Koreans and South Koreans have made incursions into the DMZ and their rival states. While some border incidents occurred back in the 50s and early 60s, one of the bloodiest early incidents began in October 1966 and went through to December of 69. Some consider it a second Korean War, but this incident is better known as the Korean DMZ conflict. In 1966, with US forces and some South Korean divisions tied up in the Vietnam War, Kim Il-sung believed South Korea was in a more vulnerable position. He deployed some 386,000 troops along the DMZ. By this point, a man named Park Chung-hee was the president of South Korea. In answer, he sent out some 585,000 troops backed by a US Army, a US Corps, and 2 US divisions, a combined force that smeared itself across the edge of the DMZ. The The North did not opt for a full-blown invasion, however. Instead, Kim Il-sung sent small units of lightly armed soldiers trained in guerrilla warfare to infiltrate South Korea and upset the South Korean defense. Lacking dedicated anti-guerrilla units, thousands of Kim Il-sung's infiltrators slipped through the South Korean lines, clashing with soldiers and civilians alike. Fighting also took place within the DMZ when opposing units ran into each other during patrols. At night on the 17th of June 1968, the North Korean Spec Ops Unit, Unit 124, penetrated the DMZ to assassinate President Park in the Blue House in Seoul, an incident known as the Blue House Raid. On the night of the 21st, posing as a South Korean patrol, the operatives made it to a checkpoint just 100 meters or 330 feet from the Blue House. Luckily for Park, a police unit stopped and questioned the operatives. When they were unable to give the police the answers they wanted, a police officer drew his pistol and Unit 124 opened fire. As they fled the checkpoint and back across the border, 29 of Unit 124's 31 operatives were shot dead. One escaped and one was captured. While Unit 124 managed to kill 30 South Koreans and Americans and wound a further 66 as they went, they absolutely failed their mission objective. After the failed Blue House raid, the South tightened its defenses, so Kim Il-sung looked to the coastline instead. On the 30th of October 1968, North Korea landed 120 Unit 124 operatives in South Korea's Gyeongsang and Gangwon provinces, intending to set up guerrilla bases in the Taebaek Mountains and indoctrinate the locals. The landing went well enough, but when they reached the mountains, they found out that the South Korean villagers had already been taught to guard themselves against communist infiltrators. The locals informed the authorities and some 70,000 South Korean troops went out on a manhunt through to late December, killing or capturing all but 3 of the 120 men. In the final year of the Korean DMZ conflict, a pair of North Korean MiG-21s shot down an American Lockheed EC-121M Warning Star over the Sea of Japan, killing 31 men. But there weren't any other major infiltrations. Throughout that year, the North's efforts tapered and the South claimed victory. 7 years later, in August 1976, 5 workers of the Korean Service Corps, or KSC, accompanied by 2 US Army officers, a South Korean captain, and 11 United Nations personnel, entered the DMZ's Joint Security Area to fell an obscuring poplar tree near the so-called Bridge of No Return. Not long after they began, some 15 North Korean soldiers arrived and told them to stop cutting the tree. The American captain, Arthur Boniface, ignored the North Koreans, telling his boys to keep on cutting. Then, a further 20 North Koreans arrived in a truck carrying crowbars and clubs. At this point, the KSC workers dropped their axes and gave it legs. The North Koreans seized the weapons and turned them on the US officers, hacking and bludgeoning Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett. Boniface was killed on the spot and they fatally wounded Barrett, who died on the way to the hospital. Later, the North Koreans claimed they had acted out of self-defense. The US Army, the UN Joint Security Force, and the South Koreans retaliated by means of Operation Paul Bunyan, driving to the Joint Security Area with chainsaws to end the poplar tree for good. While the Americans and South Koreans deployed a great many troops and military assets, including attack helicopters, fighter jets, and bombers, to oversee the operation, things did not escalate beyond a good old-fashioned demeasuring. Now, let's jump ahead 20 years to 1996, 2 years after Kim Il-sung died of a heart attack. On the 16th of September, a North Korean Sang-oh-class submarine ran aground trying to deposit a recon team on the South Korean coast near the town of Jeongdongjin. With the sub out of action, 23 North Koreans tried to sneak their way overland to the DMZ. The South Koreans soon caught wind of them, deploying some 43,000 soldiers to hunt the enemy operatives down. They ultimately killed 13 of the operatives, found the corpses of 11 executed by their own men, and captured 1. The final operative was listed as missing. The captured man was taken in for interrogation. He revealed everything and later defected to the south. Less than 3 years later, something went down in the West Sea. In June 1999, the North Koreans, now led by Supreme Leader Kim Jong-il, decided to redraw the maritime boundary between the North and the South, known as the Northern Limits Line, or NLL. A few days after the North Koreans started testing the NLL on the 9th of June, crossing the line near Yeonpyeong Island, the South Korean Navy retaliated by physically bumping into the North Korean vessels instead of being the ones to fire the first shots. On the 15th, around 20 North Korean fishing boats, 4 patrol boats and at least 1 torpedo boat were south of the NLL, ramming the South Korean vessels as the South Koreans had previously done to them. At around 9:30 am, a North Korean patrol boat got sandwiched between 2 enemy boats and decided to respond by firing on them with machine guns and a 25mm cannon. The South Koreans entered in kind and a skirmish broke out, with the South Koreans sinking 1 torpedo boat, damaging 5 patrol boats, killing as many as 30 men and wounding a further 70. By 11 am, the North Koreans had limped back over the NLL. In 2002, the Koreans clashed once again in a second battle of Yeonpyeong, though the bombardment of Yeonpyeong in 2010 was far more significant. On the 23rd of November, some 70,000 South Korean and US troops were performing their annual Hoguk exercise, which was essentially a giant military drill that took place on Yeonpyeong Island and Bangyong Island south of the NLL. They used live rounds during the drill, but stated they were aiming their fire to the south. The North Koreans thought otherwise, believing it was some sort of attack. At around 2:30 p.m, batteries on the islands of Mudo and Kemori started shelling Yeonpyeong, firing 2 barrages in total. The guns at Yeonpyeong answered. After about an hour, the North stopped firing and the South followed suit an hour after that. All in all, just 2 South Korean civilians and 2 soldiers were killed, while a further 22 were wounded. The attack started fires all throughout the island, however, destroying 70% of its forests and fields and around 30 buildings. The North's Korean Central News Agency later claimed that the South had used the civilians present on the island as a human shield to cover military action.
The conflicts of Yemen are too often forgotten by the world. There have been so many, one right after the other, and we've reached a point where none of us have been alive during a time of peace. As the war, which started all the way back in 2014, rages on, it's important to look at Yemen's history to understand where it all started. When you look at a map of today's conflict in Yemen, you can see a very distinct divide between who controls the north and south. That's because, until 1990, Yemen was divided into 2 countries. And the conflict we see today draws a lot of similarities from the North Yemen Civil War of the 1960s, when the country was divided by 2 contrasting ideologies for Islamic governance. In this video, we're going to dive into the North Yemen Civil War and discover why this conflict shouldn't be forgotten. The Ottomans controlled Yemen when it was split between North and South in 1904, where North Yemen was ruled by the Ottomans and South Yemen was ruled by the British. However, following the First World War and the complete dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, North Yemen found itself independent and became an Islamic state ruled by imams. North Yemen only had 3 imams in total before it fell. The first imam of the fragile state was Imam Yahya Hamididen, who ruled until his assassination in 1948. He was succeeded by his son, Imam Ahmad bin Yahya. Ahmad bin Yahya was, in comparison to his father, a modernist. He worked toward modernizing the country, including reversing his father's ban on aircraft, and even worked toward more international engagement. However, he continued his father's draconian methods on law and order and remained essentially an autocrat, retaining control over even minor decisions throughout the kingdom. Despite his advances and family lineage, Yahya was deeply unpopular. During his time on the throne, a massive wave of Arab nationalism was sweeping through the Middle East and North Africa, started by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose dream was to unite all Arab countries into one massive pan-Arab state. Nasser tried hard to make his dream a reality and established the United Arab Republic in February 1958, which initially consisted of Egypt and Syria. A month later, Imam Ahmad bin Yahya went to Damascus to bring Yemen into the fold. In exchange, he wanted to maintain his tenuous grip on the nation. To the people of North Yemen, being part of the United Arab Republic should have meant that they could be rid of their malevolent ruler. The Imam was ruthless, even being called medieval by his contemporaries, as he ordered decapitations and amputations for any dissidents. His laws were arbitrary and inconsistent, and the people suffered under him, and he was subjected to many attempted coups and assassinations. During one such attempt, multiple army officers emptied their revolvers into his body at point-blank range, only for the Imam to survive. Having grown up watching his grandfather and father rule, Muhammad al-Badr knew it would someday be his place to lead North Yemen. Al-Badr, however, was drawn to the growing wave of nationalism and modernism gripping the Arab world. Even though al-Badr was a huge admirer of Nasser's ideologies and began bringing in Egyptian experts to help modernize Yemen as early as 1959, it wasn't enough to squash the people's vitriol toward the royals. And none of this was lost on Yemen's once ally, Egypt. Even Nasser himself wanted to dispose of the royal family in Yemen. In January 1962, he began supporting the Free Yemen movement, a nationalist organization dedicated to throwing out the regime. He gave them money, an office, and even airtime on the radio to spread their ideology. Nasser wanted to be rid of the royals of North Yemen and the British of South Yemen so he could maintain his status as a leader in the Arab world, a reputation he was losing due to the fact that the United Arab Republic was already unraveling. And as nationalist ideologies spread further within Yemen, there was no shortage of groups vying for control over the fledgling nation. There had already been an assassination attempt on Imam Ahmad in June 1961, which left the ruler crippled. But he held on until September 1962, when he died in his sleep. After his father's death, Crown Prince Muhammad al-Badr became the Imam. It was barely a week later, on September 25th, when al-Badr began hearing shelling outside the royal palace and saw tanks advancing. And he was shocked to see the man he had personally appointed to be the commander of the royal guard, Abdullah al-Salal, leading the attack on his home. And he wasn't acting alone. He was leading a coup that included police, military, and even students from the military academy. The revolutionaries battled the palace guard, still loyal to the Imam, and the fighting stretched all through the night, with tanks in the street and artillery firing incessantly. The revolutionaries took over the palace armory, secured the radio station, and advanced further into the palace grounds. When it became obvious there was no winning the fight, Imam al-Badr escaped through the garden at the back of his palace with his personal servants. By early the following morning, the revolutionaries had won, and come late morning, they had the entire palace secured and made a radio broadcast announcing that the regime had been overthrown and the new government, run by the revolutionaries, was now in charge. The Mutawakkilite Kingdom of Yemen was now the Yemen Arab Republic, and Salal was its president. Within the next couple of days, rumors began to fly around that al-Badr was dead, but Salal knew he wasn't. Knowing that there were still royalists in the country, he gave them a warning, saying, "The corrupt monarchy which ruled for 1,000 years was a disgrace to the Arab nation and to all humanity. Anyone who tries to restore it is an enemy of God and man." By September 28th, al-Badr was confirmed to be in neighboring Saudi Arabia, where the royal family there was sympathetic to his plight. Nasser and his government were very happy with the success of the coup, and on September 29th, he sent a battalion of his special forces to Yemen's capital of Sana'a to act as Salah's personal guard. He also sent Egyptian General Ali Abdul Hamid to work with the Yemeni Revolutionary Command Council and assess what they needed so they could lend more support. The presence of the Egyptian military in Sana'a made the Saudis nervous, as they feared invasion of their country, so they sent troops in to guard the border between the two countries. By early October, Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia was already sending weapons to royalist tribes in the northern region of Yemen, and conflict seemed inevitable. They had remained loyal to the Imam because they were primarily Shia Muslim, just like al-Badr, and in 1963 alone, Saudi Arabia supplied them with $15 million worth of weapons. The Imam had the support of the ambassadors from London, Bonn, Amman, and Washington, D.C., whereas Salal had his support from Cairo, Belgrade, Rome, and Moscow. In fact, the Soviet Union was all in on Salal, and Nikita Khrushchev himself said that any act of aggression against Yemen will be considered an act of aggression against the Soviet Union. From there, the diplomatic negotiations started. The president of the US at the time, John F. Kennedy, was very wary of violence breaking out in Yemen as it had the potential to spread across the Middle East. He sent notes to both sides advising that Nasser should withdraw his troops and Faisal should stop supplying arms to the royalists. Nasser agreed, but only on the condition that Saudi Arabia and Jordan, who were also supplying weapons, stop all aggressive operations on the frontiers. Saudi Arabia and Jordan did not agree to this, not because they wanted an armed conflict in Yemen, but because they didn't trust Nasser to actually withdraw his troops. The Saudis were afraid that if Nasser had unfettered access to Yemen, he would then come for Saudi Arabia and its oil, and the Jordanians feared that if Nasser got his hands on Saudi Arabia, they would be next. The two countries asked the United States not to officially recognize Salal and his government, stressing that the Imam would come back into power. The US held off as long as it could, but due to international pressure, it gave in and became the 34th country to formally recognize the Yemen Arab Republic on December 19, 1962. The next day, the United Nations followed suit and considered the republic to be the only authority in Yemen. The only major world power that didn't recognize Salal's government was Britain, which still held on to a colony in South Yemen called Aden. The British were afraid of Nasser's presence in North Yemen because they feared an Arab coalition which may threaten their hold over the territory. They needn't have worried though, because the people of South Yemen were very capable of freeing themselves. To learn more about the Aden Emergency that ended the British colony, check out our previous video on the topic. All countries involved in the conflict in North Yemen tried to solve it through diplomacy for the following 6 months, but none of their efforts were successful. Nasser would not pull out his troops and the Saudis would not stop supplying weapons to the royalists. Soon enough, the violence started. By the beginning of 1963, the number of Egyptian troops in North Yemen had risen from 12,000 to 28,000, with a good number of Soviet bloc personnel joining them. And to help supplement the ground troops, Egypt also began sending in fighter bombers, with some going to the Saudi-Yemeni border and others to the northwest coast, where they began operating airstrikes. The Egyptian troops first worked feverishly in October and November of 1962 to stem the royalist advances in the northern portion of the nation, successfully doing so by the end of November when they took the city of Sada from the royalists. They then began working to secure major routes leading in and out of the capital Sanaa, as well as the major cities of Taiz and Hodeidah. This phase of the war, characterized by counterinsurgency operations, would become known as the Ramadan Offensive. It started in February 1963 when a task force comprised of 15 tanks, 18 trucks, 20 armored cars, and a number of jeeps took off from Sanaa and headed north to a town called Sada near the border to Saudi Arabia, with more garrison troops following behind. They moved from town to town, occupying territory wherever they could, but not without resistance. During one battle, 500 royalists spent a week fighting the Egyptians on a sheer-sided hill 25 miles or 40 kilometers outside of Sanaa. With all their fancy new weapons given to them by Faisal, they were able to kill 160 Egyptian soldiers along with 3 tanks and 7 armored cars. Despite their heroic resistance, the royalists lost strategic territory that limited their supply runs. They eventually found a way around this loss by using camels instead of trucks to move supplies through the mountainous northern regions while avoiding towns held by the Egyptians. By doing this, they were able to strengthen their armies, and slowly they began to recover areas previously lost to the Republican fighters. This sort of tug of war, losing and then regaining territory with neither side really having the upper hand, continued for more than a year and a half before any negotiations took place. In September 1964, Nasser and Faisal met in Alexandria for the Arab Summit. There, both sides agreed that they didn't want any more violence. By that time, Egypt had 40,000 troops in Yemen and had already lost an estimated 10,000 others. Both Nasser and Faisal had officially agreed to cooperate with each other, stop the armed conflict in Yemen, and come to a peaceful solution. Their talks went well. So well, in fact, that they were widely praised across the Arab world, and the United States even called them a major step toward an eventual peaceful settlement of the long civil war. Even Faisal left Egypt feeling good, saying that his heart was brimming with love for President Nasser. Following the successful peace talks, a secret conference was held in Sudan on November 2nd, during which the Royalists and Republicans both agreed to a ceasefire that would go into effect on the 6th, less than a week later. 9 representatives on each side of the conflict worked out the terms of the ceasefire, with representatives from Egypt and Saudi Arabia overseeing the negotiations. The next phase was for the 168 tribal leaders in Yemen to get together for a conference on November 23rd. The plan was to name provisional national executives made up of 2 Republicans, 2 Royalists, and 1 neutral party. From there, they would run the country temporarily to plan a vote which would determine whether to continue running the country as a republic or go back to the royal system of imams. But before the conference could happen, and for reasons which are still unclear, the Egyptians resumed their bombings of royalist territories. The conference was initially pushed to November 30th, but as violence engulfed the region once more, the conference was postponed indefinitely. This time, the Royalists, who had previously focused on counteroffensives, began more proactive measures to try and drive out the Egyptians. To accomplish this, they set to cutting off the Egyptian lines of communication within Yemen. The Egyptians had a web of communication spread out across the country that avoided much of the mountains, which the Royalists controlled. The plan was to capture garrisons along the communications lines and thus prevent further Egyptian movement. They worked with the Num tribe, who pretended to align with the Egyptians and gave the Royalists time to occupy 2 mountains surrounding one of their targets in exchange for first dibs on looting the garrison when they were done. They set up 75mm guns and mortars and aimed them right at the garrison. They then launched a surprise attack, during which they opened fire on the Egyptians, and the people of the Num tribe jumped out from behind the rocks to attack. The attack was successful, and in no time at all, they had some of the Egyptian troops surrendering and the rest fleeing. The Royalists had similar success at other garrisons as well, but by June 1965, the Royalists had lost some 40,000 men, significantly more than Egypt, which had lost a little more than 15,000. Despite the recent Royalist success, the Egyptians just wouldn't back down, and the 2 sides eventually reached a stalemate. That stalemate was rather costly for Egypt, who lost $500,000 a day to the war. In a speech to his people in 1965, Nasser said, "We're facing difficulties. We must work harder and make sacrifices. I have no magic button that I can push to produce the things we want." To try and help pay for the war without increasing the $3 billion of foreign debt that they were already facing, Nasser increased income tax and tariffs on non-essential imports and imposed a defense tax on all sales. But even with the additional money and additional troops, there were now 60,000 Egyptian troops in Yemen, and even with launching the largest offensive of the war yet, they couldn't break the stalemate. Further peace talks between Nasser and Faisal occurred the same year, and within 48 hours of meeting in Jeddah, the two had agreed to the gradual withdrawal of Egyptian troops over a 10-month period and the cessation of Saudi support to the Royalists. But just like the peace talks from the year before, nothing came of this agreement, and the state of war continued. No matter the new strategy, the new money, or the new troops, the war pressed on and went nowhere. Not even a chemical attack on behalf of the Egyptians, although they deny it, in January 1967 that killed 140 people and injured another 270, could tip the scales. As 1967 wore on, Egypt was hemorrhaging money just to keep funding a war it was neither winning nor losing. The previous economic measures they had put in place to help foot the bill were no longer enough, so they added more. Taxes for middle and upper class citizens were increased, along with workers' monthly compulsory savings, which went up by 50%. On top of that, Nasser cut overtime pay, reduced the national sugar ration by 1/3, and halted all major industrial programs. And Yemen wasn't the only conflict the Egyptian military was wrapped up in. In June 1967, they lost 15,000 troops in the 6-day war fought against Israel. To try and make up for their losses, they pulled 15,000 troops out of Yemen. With all this strain, Egypt couldn't hold much longer. In the wake of the Six-Day War, the Khartoum Resolution was issued. The document mostly covered peace efforts between Egypt and Israel, but Egypt also used it as a way to announce they were finally ready to end the war in North Yemen. Nasser reached out to Faisal and proposed they revive the Jeddah peace agreement from 2 years previous, which Faisal was happy to adhere to. They both signed a formal treaty, with Egypt promising to withdraw its remaining 20,000 troops and Saudi Arabia promising to halt its funding of the royalists. This time, each side stuck to its word. Salal was furious with Nasser and accused him of betrayal. He wasn't done fighting and he needed Nasser's support. Without it, his popularity among his troops took a nosedive and they began turning on him. There were 2 bazooka attacks on the palace, and Salal either fired or ordered the executions of several people in his cabinet. It was obvious that his hold on the country was becoming loose, so when he visited Nasser in Cairo later that year, Nasser advised him to go into exile, which he refused to do. Until the coup, that is. Nasser ordered his remaining troops not to interfere in any attempted coup, which was all but inevitable. The inevitable occurred on November 5th, when royalist forces, completely unopposed by Egyptian troops, surrounded the palace complex in Sana'a, leading to what would be known as the Siege of Sana'a in 1967. The Republic persisted instead of reverting back to the Imamites, and the new government was now headed by 3 of Salal's former cabinet members. The political heat in Yemen was too hot though, and they soon fled the country, leaving behind Prime Minister Hassan al-Amri to be in charge of things. Though Egypt and Saudi Arabia had left, the war went on for 3 more years as the royalists refused to give in, and they fought until their remaining supplies ran dry. In 1970, Saudi Arabia formally recognized North Yemen as the Yemeni Arab Republic, bringing forth a formal end to the war. The Republicans and the remaining royalists signed a ceasefire, and the Republicans had officially won the war. In exchange for signing the ceasefire, the Saudi government gave North Yemen a grant of 20 million. Around the same time, South Yemen had finally kicked out the British and was in the process of forming its own country. North and South Yemen had a short border war in 1972, which ended with both sides agreeing to unite, a process that wouldn't conclude until 1990. Though the North Yemen civil war had officially ended, violence never really stopped in that pocket of the world. Between North and South Yemen, and now Yemen as a whole, one conflict has just bled into the next, over and over again, with much of the world, whether purposely or not, turning a blind eye. We hope that things eventually change. In May 2000, a British Special Forces unit infiltrated a village in regional Sierra Leone. The village was right on the edge of enemy territory, and the operators were expecting a fight. What they weren't expecting, however, was to find a platoon of Nigerian soldiers holed up there. With orders to defend the village and wait for reinforcements, the men had held their positions for months without resupply. Only days after the British arrival, these men were outnumbered and fighting to the death against a battalion of gangster rap fanatics. This is the fascinating story behind one of the strangest battles in modern military history. In 1991, a rebel group composed of largely disgruntled young men arose in Sierra Leone's countryside. Fed up with the established elites in the capital, Freetown, hoarding the nation's vast diamond wealth, they began a populist campaign. Named the Revolutionary United Front, the group wasn't affiliated with left or right-wing politics, nor with any ethnicity or religion. Their goal, as stated by their leader Fode Sanko, was no more slaves, no more masters, power and wealth to the people. Great in principle, but once Sanko controlled the diamond mines, he decided to keep the wealth for himself. Sierra Leone's economy promptly collapsed. To protect his newfound wealth and combat government forces, Sanko armed the RUF with weapons imported from allied rebel groups in neighboring Liberia. The RUF also began a terror campaign across the country, forcibly recruiting child soldiers and killing people indiscriminately. Infamously, they cut the hands, arms and legs from nearly 200,000 Sierra Leonean civilians. They rationalized that amputees could not mine diamonds to support the government. After this had been going on for 8 years, the United Nations got its paperwork sorted out and decided to launch a peacekeeping mission. The United Nations mission in Sierra Leone, known as UNAMSIL, deployed in 1999 to enforce peace via violence. A large contingent of the soldiers fighting in UNAMSIL were seconded from the Nigerian army. Seen as tough, no-nonsense fighters, the Nigerians were welcomed by Sierra Leone's civilians. By July, the UN had brought the RUF to the negotiating table. They agreed to end the civil war and to bring back democracy. But once the UN backed off, the RUF started fighting again. In May 2000, the rebels blocked the road between Freetown and the airport, effectively besieging the city. Hundreds of foreign aid workers and civilians were trapped and at the mercy of the RUF. That's when the British got involved. British and Indian Special Forces led the charge into Sierra Leone. They first secured the airport, called Lunge, and began evacuating UNAMSIL personnel. Across the country, SAS operators and elite Gurkha troops from the Indian Army conducted hostage rescue operations and surgical strikes against RUF forces. This effectively splintered the more disparate parts of the RUF into separate factions. One of these splinter groups was the West Side Boys. Mostly comprising former child soldiers and led by an ex-army corporal that promoted himself to brigadier, the West Side Boys were obsessed with American gangster rap culture and renowned for their extreme cruelty. On May 10th, the Pathfinder platoon of 1 Para, which is essentially the British Paratroop Regiment's elite force, was deployed to the village of Lunge Lol. This settlement was an isolated pocket of civilization in the jungle and lay directly between a group of 600 West Side Boys and the airport. It was here, in Lunge Lol, that the Pathfinders ran into the Forgotten platoon. The Pathfinders arrived by Chinook, rapidly deploying from 2 aircraft and fanning out to secure the village. Intelligence on rebel movements was scarce, and they expected to be shot at as soon as they arrived at the landing zone. Eyes watched them from the trackless jungle, but no shots were fired. Within minutes, the Brits secured the village's perimeter and their Chinooks flew away. The men were on high alert, expecting an attack at any moment. Suddenly, a man appeared from a low hut. The man was tall and dressed in an immaculate green uniform. His boots were polished to a high shine and his shirt was pressed and starched to a T. Freshly shaven and sporting a pair of enormous shiny aviators as well as a light blue UN beret, the man strolled casually over to where the Pathfinders were digging in. Sergeant Heaney remembered vividly what happened next. In an upper-class British accent, the man politely said, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Lieutenant Oronto Obasanjo from the Nigerian Army, forming up part of UNAMSIL, the United Nations peacekeeping mission here in Sierra Leone. You are most welcome. You are from which nation's military? Her Majesty's Armed Forces, if I'm not mistaken." Recovering from the immediate shock of such a friendly reception, Heaney handed Obasanjo over to his commander, Captain Harris. Mission-oriented and still on alert, Harris first got Obasanjo to brief him on Lunge Lol's geography, contact with the enemy, and about everything else a ground commander might want to know. Only later, once the trenches had been dug and the Pathfinders could see no attack was coming immediately, did Harris get Obasanjo's full story. Obasanjo and his 16-man platoon had been deployed to Lunge Lol 6 months before as part of the first wave of UNAMSIL soldiers. Since then, they had received no orders, no food supplies, no ammunition, no communication, and had not seen a single person from outside the village. In return for their security presence, the Lunge Lol villagers fed and housed the men. However, most had, quote, gone native. Heaney later recalled that the Nigerian platoon had basically been left marooned for 6 months, so at some point during that time, the guys themselves had got out of their uniform, put local gear on, married local girls, and were now part of the village. The soldiers believed that they had been abandoned by the UN and had begun new lives as Lunge Lol villagers. They wore sarongs like the locals and didn't carry weapons anymore. Only Obasanjo had faith that eventually the UN would come to relieve them. He maintained his uniform as well as he could and kept his weapon and equipment as clean as possible. It's hard to imagine how he would have felt when Harris told him the Pathfinders weren't his relief force. They were there to take the fight to the enemy. The West Side Boys knew British soldiers protected Lunge Lol, but they had seen only 2 helicopters fly in, informing them that the defending force was small. Believing their superior numbers and heavy weaponry would prove decisive, the West Side Boys decided to attack. They named their mission Operation Kill British, and their battle plan was equally creative. At around 0445 on the morning of May 17th, the West Side Boys' vanguard approached Lungailol. In the early morning darkness, one of the rebels let loose a battle cry and advanced on the village. Behind him was a column of 30 to 40 West Side Boys, all armed with AK-47s. The man at the front fired a single shot from the hip, but his rifle immediately jammed. Stopping to clear it, neither he nor the men behind him realized they were all in a kill zone. The Pathfinders and Nigerians had spent a full week preparing Lungailol's defenses. An influx of villagers displaced from other settlements by the West Side Boys provided a steady stream of intelligence, and the defenders knew exactly where the attack would come from. The Brits set up a forward trench backed up by 3 support trenches to the rear. They planned to bear the brunt of the attack while Obasanjo's forgotten platoon covered the flanks. To back them up, the Pathfinders had 2 mortar pits in the village with 51mm mortars. When the West Side Boys leader stopped to clear his jam, 3 machine guns opened fire on him and his men. They were nearly all cut down. After their frontal assault failed, the West Side Boys flipped to page 2 of the World War I battle manual and started a heavy bombardment. For over an hour, they battered the defenses with rockets, mortar shells, and heavy weapons fire. Over the din, Obasanjo could be heard shouting encouragement to his men. All held their positions while the Pathfinder mortars did their deadly work. Firing illumination rounds and high explosives alternately, the mortars kept the battlefield lit up enough for the trench machine gunners and riflemen to hold the West Side Boys back. Several times they launched frontal assaults, but the defenders' withering fire kept forcing them back. After sunrise, the attack waned. The West Side Boys kept up sporadic fire into the defenses, but eventually pulled back, broken. They took some of their dead with them, but left at least 25 bodies on the battlefield. One villager had been hit by a ricochet, and the Pathfinder's medic tended to her wounds. There were no other friendly casualties. The defense at Lungailol had a cascading effect on the war in Sierra Leone. The West Side Boys broke up and joined other rebel groups, telling stories of the British Pathfinders and the forgotten Nigerian platoon. Morale across the RUF began to collapse, and the rebels began infighting. Within a few months, this infighting had destroyed the RUF's organization, and they no longer posed a significant threat to Sierra Leone. After 16 days in Lungailol, the Pathfinders left the same way they'd arrived. Back at the base in Freetown, they reported the village's situation to the UN officials. The UN officers had no idea there were Nigerian peacekeepers in the area and had stopped paying Lieutenant Obasanjo and his platoon months ago. But while the Brits left, Obasanjo remained. Still carrying out his order, he stayed with his forgotten platoon, keeping watch over the village of Lungailol. That was the incredible story of how a British Special Forces unit teamed up with some peacekeepers the UN forgot about to fight off a mob of gangster rap fanatics. In a recent video, we discussed the Malayan Emergency, an oft-forgotten conflict fought in British Malaya between 1948 and 1960. While the British, largely by means of the infamous Briggs Plan, may have come out on top in that war, the Malayan Communist Party wasn't yet ready to give up its gloves. In 1968, after an 8-year lull, they took up arms once again, sparking what was known as the Communist Insurgency in Malaysia, or the Second Malayan Emergency. Without repeating everything we covered in our video on the First Malayan Emergency, this is roughly what happened. During the Second World War, the Japanese invaded Malaya via a beach in the state of Kelantan and smashed through the British defensive lines. Losing ground fast, the British struck a deal with the Malayan Communist Party, or MCP, freeing ethnic Chinese communists from prison so they could help staunch the Japanese advance by means of guerrilla operations. These guerrillas were together the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, or MPA-JA, and by the time they were ready to rumble, it was too late. The Japanese had already taken Malaya. Throughout the war, the MPA-JA grew to include some 7,000 guerrillas. After America nuked Japan and Japan surrendered, the British returned to Malaya, but now the Malayans knew the British could bleed. In 1948, the remnants of the demobilized MPA-JA reunited under the Malayan National Liberation Front, or MNLA, and fought a second guerrilla war, this time against the British, the pro-British Malayans, and the Commonwealth. Under the Briggs Plan, the British forcefully relocated or detained much of Malaya's ethnic Chinese population, denying the MNLA its support system. They also burned their crops. In the end, coupled with the 6,700 casualties inflicted upon the guerrillas, the Briggs Plan wore the MNLA down and its remnants fled across the Thai border to regroup. In 1963, Malaya federated with Singapore, Sarawak and North Borneo, and Malaysia was born. While Peninsular Malaysia was no longer under the yoke of the British, things were far from chill. Racial tensions between Malays and Chinese soared. Communist insurgents were causing a ruckus in Sarawak, Malaysia and Indonesia were fighting an undeclared war in Borneo, Singapore was soon to be expelled from the Federation, and the Moro pirates from the Philippines were sacking the Malayan state of Sabah. To top it off, the MCP was totally not in power, and that simply wouldn't do. Along the Malaysian southern Thailand border, the MNLA guerrillas stirred. After its defeat in the First Malayan Emergency, the MCP, headed by Secretary General Chin Peng, retrained its guerrillas and shoved its ideology even further down their throats. By 1968, there were just 600 9-to-5 guerrillas and 1,000 reservists in bases along the Thai border. But these men were willing to fight and die for what they believed in, and many were experienced veterans. Most were ethnic Chinese, though the MNLA recruited non-Chinese Malays and Thais as well. They even established what they called the Islamic Brotherhood Party to coax Muslims into their ranks. Back in 1961, Chin had met with Deng Xiaoping of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, in secret, and Deng had convinced Chin that Peninsular Malaysia was screaming for revolt. He had even promised Chin a cheeky $100,000 if he launched a second insurgency. By June 1968, Chin's guerrillas were ready to roll. On the 17th, they ambushed the security forces of the Malaysian government in Croh in the peninsula's north, killing 17 men. In May the following year, there was a general election. In the lead up to the event, the MNLA spread throughout the peninsula, encouraging Chinese youths to boycott the ruling multi-ethnic coalition known as the Alliance Party. The alliance lost seats to the Chinese-dominated parties the Democratic Action Party and Parti Gerakan, and a few days later, race riots broke out in Kuala Lumpur, with Malays, Chinese and Indians murdering each other in the streets. Security forces were deployed and the government suspended the parliament, declaring a state of emergency. All in all, more conservative estimates claim that 196 people were killed in the riots. Most of the dead were Chinese, and some 6,000 Chinese homes and businesses went up in flames. It's unclear how much the MNLA contributed to the election result and the subsequent riots, though its numbers had swelled in the process. To facilitate further growth, they set up a secret radio station known as the Voice of the People's Revolution to spread Maoist propaganda throughout Peninsular Malaysia. The Malaysian government responded as the British had in the First Malayan Emergency, with special forces. In October 1969, the Spec Ops Unit Very Able Troopers 69, or VAT 69, was created. Some 1,600 officers from the Royal Malaysia Police applied for the unit, but only 60 passed the basic commando training tests and went on to be trained by the British SAS. By 1972, the SAS had trained 104 men, making a full squadron. After the SAS left, the New Zealand Special Air Service flew in and trained a further 208. A fourth squadron was later readied by VAT officers themselves. The special branch of the Royal Malaysia Police also set out to wage a war of counterintelligence against the guerrillas. With VAT 69 and the special branch conducting counterinsurgency operations against the MNLA, the communist organization started to crumble from the inside out. Rumors spread that the MCP and MNLA had been compromised. The dude to your left could easily be a government spy. The MCP Central Committee investigated these rumors, deeming that as many as 90% of the ethnic Chinese Thai MNLA recruits were, in fact, spies. Some believed, however, that the Central Committee itself had been infiltrated. The VAT and Special Branch had made an absolute mess of things, which was exactly what they wanted, and in 1970, the MCP split into two breakaway factions: the Communist Party of Malaya Marxist-Leninist, or CPM-ML, and the Communist Party of Malaya Revolutionary Faction, or CPM-RF, if you weren't sick of all the acronyms yet. The The MNLA guerrillas split up as well, creating three distinct groups. One based in Thailand's East Betong, which remained with Chin and the MCP Central Committee, one in West Betong, and one in Sadao. These organizations continued to fight for their shared goals throughout the early 1970s, and the Malaysian government continued to wear them down. One of the ways the government did this was through the Security and Development Program, or KESPAN. Essentially, the KESPAN program introduced to the peninsula improved security and development. We're talking about better policing, including the creation of the Volunteer Corps and Neighborhood Watches, the censorship of insurgent propaganda, improved governmental coordination, rural development, including the construction of public utilities, roads, schools and hospitals, and the relocation of villages from areas prone to communist indoctrination. Throughout this time, the West Betong and Sadao groups disintegrated, ultimately surrendering to the Thai government in 1987. Those still fighting for the splintered MCP now understood that they were fighting a losing battle. In fact, the aforementioned Deng Xiaoping had been encouraging his old friend Chin to throw in the towel since 1981. He also pulled support of the MNLA's secret radio station. In 1988, the Malaysian government delivered a relatively cordial knockout blow, inviting the MCP leadership to attend a negotiation for peace. At this point, Malaysia's economy was going strong, and with reference to the overarching climate of the Cold War, the Eastern Bloc was falling apart. There was less poverty and racism, and no one was screaming for a communist revolt anymore. The times had changed. The MCP signed the so-named Peace Agreement of Hat Yai in Thailand on the 2nd of December 1989. Some former guerrillas, inspired by government financial incentives, returned to Malaysia, while others chose to stay behind and live in the villages on the Thai border. As for Chin, he wanted to go home, but the Malaysian government kept denying the poor bloke. He died in Bangkok in 2013. As for the second Malayan emergency, that ended with the peace agreement. The MNLA was no more. We've covered World War II era Greece in previous videos, from the Axis occupation to their withdrawal later in the war, but we haven't really gone into the specifics of the infighting which occurred in the country during the war and after it. In this video, we provide you with an overview of the Greek Civil War, as well as an intimate insight into the Macedonian side of the conflict you definitely haven't heard before. In October 1940, Fascist Italy invaded Greece from occupied Albania. It did not go well. The Hellenic army broke the Italian offensive over the Greek-Albanian border, then drove the Italians back into Albania and fought them there. Mussolini was a wreck, and Hitler wasn't too happy with him either. According to Italian historian Mario Toscano, the consequences of this era were so serious as to bring about Italy's complete subjection to Germany as far as the political and military direction of the war was concerned. In April 1941, Hitler took the reins, invading Greece using blitzkrieg tactics. By June, the country was in Axis hands, divided into a German occupation zone, an Italian one, and a Bulgarian one. King George II of Greece and the Greek government, except for Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas, who died back in January, fled to Egypt, and the Germans set up a collaborationist government in Athens. The occupation was brutal, especially in the German zone. The Axis powers destroyed Greek industry, infrastructure, and the economy, facilitated the starvation of tens of thousands of civilians, and outright murdered tens of thousands more, including some 60,000 Jews. The Greek people didn't just sit around and let it happen though. Loathing the puppet government, and with their own government in exile in Egypt, the people created several major resistance movements with a range of political inclinations. Some shared the inclinations of the late Metaxas regime and the king, some sat firmly on the left, and some occupied the grey area in between. The largest left-aligned organization was the National Liberation Front, or the EAM, with its military wing, the Greek People's Liberation Army, or ELAS, both effectively controlled by the Communist Party of Greece, or KKE. The National Greek Republican League, or EDES, opposed communism but didn't stand with the monarchist government in exile. National and Social Liberation, or EKKA, was another one of the big three resistance organizations, along with the ELAS and the EDES. Greece's various resistance organizations, of which there were more than the ones mentioned above, fought not only against the Axis and their puppets, but also among themselves. Initially, the British gave most of their military support to the Communist Resistance Organization ELAS because they thought they were the best equipped to fight the Axis. But the ELAS grew so rapidly that the British began to fear a communist Greece, thus shifting their support primarily to the EDES. Still, in June 1943, the ELAS all but crushed the EKKA, and in July that same year, the British tried to get the ELAS, the EDES, and what remained of the EKKA to band together against the Axis under a joint British HQ. The three resistance organizations signed what was called the National Bands Agreement on the 5th, but evidently, the agreement didn't mean jack to the ELAS, which continued to expand and soon dwarfed the other organizations. The fighting continued from October 1943 through to February 1944, when the British negotiated a ceasefire between the resistance organizations. This was known as the Plaka Agreement, and it didn't last all that long. As the Axis withdrew from Greece in October 1944, the British understood that they had a major problem on their hands. The ELAS encompassed 90% of the Greek resistance by this stage, amounting to some 50,000 resistance fighters and as many as 1.5 million total members. The EDES and EKKA, to put it in perspective, boasted just 10,000 resistance fighters each. Many Greeks had joined ELAS not necessarily because they were communists, but because they simply wanted the Axis out of their country. With the Axis gone, the exiled Greek government, now headed by George Papandreou, returned to Greece and, with British forces entering the country, tried to put the ELAS and EDES under the government's control. This next agreement was called the Caserta Agreement, and despite conflict within the ELAS, all parties signed it. When Papandreou tried to disarm the ELAS, however, tensions grew. Wanting to maintain relations with Britain, Stalin encouraged the Communist Party of Greece to prod the ELAS toward cooperation. Simultaneously, Yugoslavian President Josip Broz Tito was poking the hornet's nest by trying to get the ELAS to resist disarmament. On the 2nd of December 1944, some 200,000 ELAS members marched into Athens to protest. It became violent and someone fired the first bullet, after which there erupted a 37-day clash in Athens between the ELAS and the British-supported Greek government. This was known as the Decemvriana. By January 1947, the ELAS had lost the battle, and in February, they signed the Treaty of Varkiza, which called for a complete demobilization of the ELAS. Many of its fighters hid their guns, however, anticipating future developments. Such developments came after the end of the Second World War. After World War II, relations between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies went down the toilet, precipitating the start of the Cold War. This bolstered the resolve of some ex-ELAS veterans who, after the Communist Party of Greece failed to defeat the returned king and the United Alignment of Nationalists in the March 1946 elections, attacked a police station in the village of Litoro near Mount Olympus. This action set the wheels of war back in motion, marking the start of the deadliest stage of the Greek Civil War. From March 1946 onwards, the ex-ELAS veterans reorganized themselves under the so-called Democratic Army of Greece, or DSE, a force backed by Tito's Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania. Opposing the DSE was the Kingdom of Greece, backed initially by Britain and later the United States. It soon became a full-blown war, but the DSE was severely outnumbered, boasting 23,000 combatants at its height, as opposed to the monarch's peak strength of over 230,000. To bolster its numbers, the DSE turned to the people of Greece, notably the Slavic Macedonians of Greek Macedonia. And this is where the aforementioned intimate insight comes in. One of our team members' grandfathers, Steve, was a boy in Greek Macedonia during the Civil War. He lived in a small mountainside village near what is now Florina. In an interview, Steve spoke about how the Greeks sent spies into the village to ensure the villagers were speaking Greek and not Macedonian. If anyone was suspected of standing against the Greeks, the Greek police would come into the village and beat the suspects, or worse. When the communists, which Steve referred to as the partisans, came to the village, they promised the villagers freedom from the Greeks. fighting for the partisans, they would win their language back, their schools. They would be, quote, a nation within a nation. Wanting to fight for freedom and recognition, Steve's oldest brother signed up willingly. He fought against the Hellenic army using weapons supplied to the partisans by Yugoslavia and went on to become a partisan commander. As the war progressed, the Greeks strafed a mountainside village in a British plane and then subjected it to an artillery bombardment. The partisans came for Steve's second oldest brother too, forcing him to join their cause. But his first oldest brother used his newfound power to spare his sibling from the same fate, sending him to safety in what is now the Republic of Greece. In March 1948, Steve's parents feared their son might get killed if he stayed in the village, so they sought the help of the partisans, who had been working with the Red Cross to transport children to safety in the neutral states outside of Greece. A boy of 6, Steve ended up in a monastery on the edge of a dark forest in Slovenia. He stayed there for 2 years, separated from his mother and father, who had to push through the 6 months of bureaucracy at the end of the war just to prove that Steve was theirs. He was just one of tens of thousands of children removed from their homes for their own safety during the Greek Civil War. Some argue that the children were forcibly taken from their families, but this wasn't the case with Steve, at least. In mid-1948, Stalin and Tito had a public falling out, and Stalin, who'd managed to keep the USSR out of the Greek Civil War, made it clear that he was opposed to the communist uprising in Greece. This fractured the DSE, with some members taking Stalin's side and others Tito's. Tito soon closed Yugoslavia's borders to the DSE, leaving only the Albanian border open to them. Bolstered by the Americans, the Hellenic army rallied and inflicted a series of severe defeats on the DSE, which crumbled throughout the rest of 1948 and 1949. Many partisans, including Steve's oldest brother, fled over the Albanian border and ultimately ended up in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. But the damage was done. Following on from the Axis occupation of the country, the Greek Civil War left Greece wounded and divided. Many families emigrated to the UK, the US, Australia, and elsewhere to seek a better life. In the post-World War II phase of the Greek Civil War alone, some 158,000 civilians lost their lives.
The Vietnam War, or Second Indochina War, is infamous. It was one of the most gruesome Cold War era conflicts, and it tarnished the USA's reputation forever. But America isn't the only large Western nation the Vietnamese have routed, and for there to be a second Indochina War, there had to be a first. Here, in the wake of World War II, Ho Chi Minh stood up to the French to expel them from what was then French Indochina. It was a brutal 7-year conflict that is so often swept under the rug. In this 3-part video, we mean to rectify that. This is the story of the First Indochina War, or as many in Vietnam remember it, the Anti-French Resistance War. As with many of the 20th century's wars, the First Indochina War was sparked by World War II. On the 25th of June 1940, France fell to the Germans, and the Vichy government, headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, replaced the Third Republic. At this time, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were ruled by the French in what was called French Indochina, so these colonial territories fell under the Vichy administration. As the Vichy government collaborated with the Germans, with Vichy France ultimately coming under direct German control, it had to collaborate with Germany's soon-to-be Axis allies too, notably Imperial Japan, and the Japanese had had their eyes on Indochina for quite some time. Fighting the Chinese in the concurrent Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese naturally wanted to cut off China's supply lines. One major supply line was the Kunming-Haiphong Railway, which went from the Indo-Chinese port of Haiphong to Hanoi and then into the Chinese province of Yunnan. Staging their troops in Indochina, specifically in the region of Tonkin, would allow them to open up a new front against their enemies in China too. With the collaborationist Vichy government now in charge of French Indochina, Japan started laying on pressure in a political sense, and the Vichy government was given an ultimatum. On one hand, they could close all supply routes to China, let Japanese troops pass through Indochina, let Japanese air forces use their air bases, and give the Japanese Navy basing rights at Guangzhou. On the other hand, the Japanese could invade. While an agreement was ultimately reached, some Japanese units weren't interested in negotiating, so they attacked the French border post of Dongdang and the province of Langson. From the 22nd to the 26th of September 1940, Japanese forces marched into northern Indochina. Following that, Japan said sorry, released the French they had taken as POWs, and returned control of the towns they had seized to the French, at least on the surface. After all, why would they go to war with the French when they could just rule them from behind the scenes and use French Indochina as a base from which they could fight everyone else? Not to mention that puppeteering the French would get a whole lot easier after the tripartite pact had been signed on the 27th, and Japan officially had Germany on its side. In Vietnam, however, not everyone was happy living under the thumb of Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai, a puppet of a French government that was itself puppeteered by the Japanese. The people's lives were more uncertain than ever, and as World War II escalated, they whispered of revolution. Before we get to that though, the Vichy French were having serious problems in October 1940, just after the Japanese invasion. Emboldened by the fall of France, the Thai Major General, Plaek Pibulsonggram, decided to bomb French Indochina and then launch an offensive through Laos and Cambodia to regain territory previously lost to the French. The Thai army was better equipped, more experienced, and numerically superior to the French, boasting some 60,000 troops, as opposed to the 50,000 troops fielded by the French. They also had more aircraft and more experienced pilots. French naval forces reigned superior in the sea though. From early to mid-January 1941, Thailand appeared to have the upper hand, overrunning Laos and pushing into Cambodia. But on the 17th, French naval forces defeated the Royal Thai Navy in the Battle of Ko Chang, and it seemed the tide was turning. It was shortly after this that Japan stepped in as a mediator, arranging a ceasefire on the 28th. To satisfy Thailand, the Japanese made the French relinquish swaths of Laos and Cambodia to Pibulsonggram. For the time being, this worked very much in Japan's favor, as the Japanese had improved their relationship with Thailand without absolutely destroying their relationship with the French. Now, back to Vietnam and those whispers of revolution. In February 1941, the leader of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, a man named Ho Chi Minh, returned home from France and established the Viet Minh in Pac Bo Cave in Vietnam's Cao Bang province. This was a coalition of communists and nationalists united in an anti-colonial independence movement against the Vichy French and the Japanese. Over the next 4 years, barring the 14 months he spent imprisoned in China, Ho Chi Minh consolidated his strength, receiving funding from the United States, the USSR, and China, and rallying as many as 1 million Vietnamese to his cause. On the 22nd of December 1944, he created the Vietnam Liberation Army and made General Vo Nguyen Giap, nicknamed Red Napoleon, its military commander. Just 3 days later, a contingent of the Liberation Army fought its first battle and won. This was the Battle of Kai Phat and Nang Gan, in which Red Napoleon personally led 33 revolutionaries in a raid against 2 French outposts, killing the outpost's armed French officers and forcing 37 colonial troops to surrender. As loot, Red Napoleon seized 40 rifles, which they would make good use of in the battles to come. By this point in the Greater War, following massive defeats in Burma and the Philippines, things weren't looking so hot for Japan. What pushed them over the edge in French Indochina, however, was the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Fearing an Allied invasion of Indochina, as well as a French uprising following the destruction of the Vichy government back in France, the Japanese stepped out from behind the curtain and seized Indochina from the French in a coup d'etat between March and May 1945. Here, some 55,000 Japanese overran some 65,000 French and French colonial soldiers throughout Indochina, capturing 15,000 and killing 4,000. Some 3,000 French fled into China, others joined the pro- or anti-Japanese guerrilla movements. At the same time, the Vietnamese were struggling with a different sort of enemy: famine. In the Vietnamese famine of 1945, between 400,000 and 2 million people starved to death as a direct result of the French and Japanese occupation, but also factors beyond their control. Natural disasters, including a series of droughts, floods, and typhoons, destroyed edible crops. The French and Japanese seized, hoarded, and exported food and burned it for fuel, forced the locals to grow industrial crops instead of edible crops, and generally did a terrible job of managing the distribution of food and alleviating starvation. Allied airstrikes against roads, warehouses, and transportation facilities did not make things any easier. All in all, Japan's coup d'etat cost Vietnam dearly. But the end times were near for the Japanese Empire. On the 6th of August, the US dropped the first bomb on the Japanese home islands, and on the 14th, Japan agreed to surrender. With his people starving and the Japanese laying down their guns, Ho Chi Minh's forces seized Hanoi and most of Indochina, persuading the puppet emperor Bao Dai to abdicate. This was known as the August Revolution, an event punctuated by Ho Chi Minh's famous independence speech, which borrowed language directly from the US Declaration of Independence. But Ho Chi Minh wasn't in the clear just yet. In fact, his first Great War was only just getting started, and by the time of his death, he would be neck deep in the dead. But we'll save that for part 2 of this video, now that we've set the stage for the First Indochina War.
Even before World War II began, tensions in the Balkan states, particularly in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria, were high. Host to a variety of different languages, religions, and ethnicities, the Balkans had been in turmoil for decades. And as the Second World War kicked off, the divides within the region only grew more pronounced. When World War II began, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia declared neutrality. However, pressure from the Germans would soon force their hands. Because Bulgaria relied on Germany for nearly 65% of its trade, the Bulgarians sought favor with the Germans and hoped to regain territories lost in the Second Balkan War. They didn't want to explicitly choose a side though. For similar reasons, Yugoslavia also tried to remain neutral, but internal conflicts between ethnic groups destabilized the kingdom. In particular, the pro-fascist Ustasha wanted to align themselves with the Axis independent Croatian state, while the Serbians sought to join the Allies. The Balkan campaign officially began with Italy's invasion of Greece through Albania in October 1940. But the Hellenic army put up a strong resistance, and by November, they had stalled the invasion near the Albanian border. Because Italy failed to advance into Greece, Germany pressured Bulgaria into signing the Tripartite Pact on the 1st of March 1941. This meant the Germans could send troops through Bulgaria to aid the Italians. Yugoslavia's Regent Prince Paul soon followed, giving in to German pressure and reluctantly signing the Tripartite Pact on the 25th of March 1941. Unfortunately for the Regent Prince, this made him very unpopular, and the Serbian nationalist Royal Yugoslav Army Air Force staged a coup d'etat just days later, replacing him with King Peter II. Hitler was not a fan of this leadership shaker. 10 days after King Peter II ascended to the throne, the Axis invaded Yugoslavia, and by the 17th of April, Yugoslavia signed an armistice forcing the young king and his ministers to flee to Britain, where they set up a government in exile. Greece fell shortly after, and by June 1941, the Axis controlled the Balkans. After their unconditional surrender, the occupied Balkan states were divided amongst the conquering powers. Bulgaria, despite not actively participating in the invasion, occupied Thrace, Macedonia, and Pomoravia. In Macedonia, the majority welcomed the Bulgarians with open arms, as many of them were ethnically Bulgarian and had faced persecution under Yugoslav Serbian rule. Germans and Italians controlled other parts of the Balkans and helped establish the new puppet state, the independent state of Croatia, in April 1941. The Prime Minister and leader of the ultra-nationalist Ustaša, Ante Pavelić, immediately began the systematic genocide of Serbian, Roma and Jewish people along with fascist dissenters. Quickly, resistances sprung up in Greece, Albania and Yugoslavia. However, because of ethnic and ideological differences, there were two distinct Yugoslavian resistance groups, the Royal Chetniks and the Communist Partisans. The Chetniks, led by former Serbian General Draža Mihailović, were initially made up of Royal Yugoslav Army troops who'd fled to the mountains of Serbia after the surrender. With the support of the Western Allies and King Peter II, the Chetniks were better equipped than the Partisans in the beginning. Conversely, the Communist Partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, were poorly organized and badly armed. However, they enjoyed some support from Spanish Civil War veterans and the Soviet Union. Unlike the Chetniks, who based their resistance on the foundation of protecting the Serbian identity, the Partisans did not run along ethnic lines, instead fighting for communist ideological values. In early resistance efforts, the two groups tried to cooperate, but this alliance would not last because of the strife caused by ethnic and ideological differences. A rift formed between the two resistance groups in the autumn of 1941 after Axis forces retook control of the Uzice territory that the Partisans had liberated. The Chetniks largely blamed the Partisans for the loss of Serbian territory within this area, and despite negotiations, the Chetniks turned openly hostile toward the Partisans. In November 1941, the Chetniks began secretly getting supplies from the Italian forces. Additionally, the Chetniks worked with the Ustaša to combat the Partisans, who they saw as a common enemy. This impeded resistance efforts and aided the Axis, who launched offensives against both groups throughout the war. The first of these offensives, Operation Southeast Croatia, took place in the winter and spring of 1942. The Germans, supported by the Italians and the Croatian Home Guard, killed 531 partisans and captured nearly 1,400 more. Tito and the partisan leaders evaded capture, however. During the operation, the Chetniks did not resist the Germans and granted them passage to the partisans. Because of this, the Central Communist Party declared the Chetniks traitors and ordered the partisans to cease any remaining cooperation with them. The second offensive, Operation Trio, took place in April and May 1942 in Bosnia and Herzegovina. While the Axis troops fought against both the Chetniks and the Partisans, the two resistance groups also clashed with each other during this operation, which led to the Axis retaking most of the liberated land. Despite losing previously gained territory, the Partisans continued to see increased support for their cause throughout the region. This support wasn't ideological in nature, but because of the brutality of the Axis forces that routinely tore through villages, raping women and killing anyone suspected of resistance. The Partisans mainly employed guerrilla warfare, slowly gaining ground and support, including some aid from the Allies. In the liberated areas, the Communists set up people's committees to act as civilian governments. In late 1942, German high command grew concerned about a possible Allied invasion of the Balkans, which would turn the tides in the resistance's favor. In January 1943, Hitler ordered another offensive, codenamed Fall Weiß, to crush the Partisans permanently. During Fall Weiß, 90,000 Italian and German troops, as well as 15,000 Chetnik collaborators, launched an attack into partisan-held territory in Bosnia, facing approximately 20,000 partisan troops. The Chetniks joined the Axis as part of their march on Bosnia, an attempt to not only take down the partisans, but also begin an ethnic cleanse of Bosnian Muslims. While over 11,000 partisans were killed, the remaining partisans narrowly escaped over the Neretva River by blowing up the bridges in their wake. In May 1942, another offensive, Fall Schwarz, was launched. Despite the Chetniks fighting alongside the Axis during Fall Weiß, Hitler worried they would side with the Allies if they invaded and ordered them to be captured and disarmed. During this operation, 127,000 Axis troops battled partisan forces in Bosnia and Montenegro, encircling the partisan headquarters between the 4th and 9th of June. Despite the odds, and while injured, Tito escaped again. The Germans retaliated by slaughtering left-behind partisans and civilians in nearby villages. This was a turning point for the partisans. The Allies and King Peter II, who had previously backed the Chetniks, now firmly favoured the partisans. Prime Minister Winston Churchill even ordered Brigadier General Fitzroy McLean to join the group as an Allied liaison. 2 months later, on the 8th of September, the Italians surrendered to the Allies. Of the 17 Italian divisions remaining in the Balkans, 3 full divisions immediately took up arms with the partisans, 2 in Montenegro and 1 in Albania. By the end of 1943, the number of partisans in the Balkans had grown to 330,000. In the spring of 1944, the Germans launched one final offensive, aiming to eliminate Tito personally. This offensive was the most well-planned and included additional air raids on the Bosnian tower of Drvar, the partisans' home base. As a result, the Allies deployed the Balkan Air Force, made up of Royal Air Force and South African Air Force units, in support of Tito, and the German operation ultimately failed. With increased air support in the Balkan region, the independent state of Croatia's Air Force and the Luftwaffe struggled to carry out further offensives. In June 1944, the partisans signed an agreement with the government in exile to form a new government that would include the communist partisans, the royalist Chetniks, and all ethnic groups in Yugoslavia. While some Chetniks defected to the partisans, others, including Mihailovic, refused. The tides continued to turn in Tito's favor. Throughout August and September 1944, Romania and Bulgaria surrendered and joined the Allies, strengthening the region against Axis powers. In September, the Red Army and the Bulgarian Army entered Yugoslavia to prevent the Germans from withdrawing to Greece. By October, the partisans controlled most of eastern Yugoslavia, including Serbia, Macedonia, and Montenegro. In the winter of 1944 and 1945, the partisans launched the Sirmian Offensive to further expel Axis and Ustasha forces from Bosnia and Croatia. The remaining Chetniks, still led by Mihailovic, launched one last attack on Axis forces, hoping to gain favor with the Allies. Fighting the Ustasha and the Croatian Home Guard, they failed to gain any ground and their numbers dwindled. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, but the war wasn't over in the Balkans. Small skirmishes continued between the partisans and the remaining Axis forces, culminating in the battles of Polania and Odjak, the latter ending 17 days after the German surrender. In November, the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was established, united under the banner of Communism despite ethnic and religious differences. In July 1946, Mihailovic and several other high Chetnik officials were tried and executed for treason. Ethnic divides and tension between groups in the Balkans led to chaotic resistance and untold destruction during the Second World War. Croatia, as a puppet state, committed a genocide second only to Hitler's, while the Chetniks and the partisans fought a quasi-civil war while also attempting to resist the Axis. Despite all the internal turmoil that arose during the war, the partisans were the most effective anti-German resistance group in all of Europe. However, this came at a cost of at least 1 million dead and millions more displaced.